Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I'll never forget the night I first heard the legend of the Whispering Woman. It was at a sleepover at my best friend Jay's house. He lived on the edge of our small town, right near the woods. The air was cool, the stars were out, and the five of us, me, Jay, Alex, Emma, and Sarah, were huddled in his room with snacks and flashlights. It was Sarah who brought up the legend. She always loved creepy stuff, and her voice got low and serious when she told the story. There's this woman, Sarah began, who used to live deep in these woods, like years and years ago. She was a healer or something, but people in town thought she was a witch. They blamed her when bad things happened. Sick cows, dead crops, stuff like that. Jay cut in. Let me guess. They burned her at the stake or something? Sarah shook her head, her face solemn. No, it was worse. They dragged her out of her house in the middle of the night and tied her to a tree. They left her there to die. No food, no water, nothing. A chill ran down my spine, and I tried to laugh it off. Okay, but how is this an urban legend? Sarah leaned closer, her voice almost a whisper now. They say her ghost still roams the woods. If you're out there alone at night, you'll hear her whispering your name. At first, it's soft, like she's far away. But each time you turn around, the whisper gets closer. Until what? Emma asked, her voice trembling just a bit. Until she's right behind you, Sarah said. And if you look at her, she takes you. Take you where? I asked, trying to sound skeptical but failing. No one knows, Sarah replied, her eyes wide. Because no one who's seen her has ever come back. We laughed nervously, but the story stuck in my mind. I wasn't about to admit it, but I was a little freaked out. Jay, being the fearless, or maybe just stupid, one in our group, decided we should test it out. Let's go into the woods, he said, grinning like an idiot. Come on, it's just a story. We all argued for a bit, but eventually, Jay wore us down. Flashlights in hand, we set off into the woods. The forest at night is a whole different world. Everything looks unfamiliar, and every little noise feels like a monster creeping up on you. The wind rustled the leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl made us jump. We walked for about 10 minutes before Sarah stopped. Okay, this is far enough, she said, her voice shaky. Jay rolled his eyes. Seriously? We're like 2 feet from your backyard. Do you want to be the one to call her? Sarah shot back. Fine, Jay said, and then he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, Whispering woman, come out and get us. Jay, stop, Emma hissed, but Jay just laughed. What? It's not real. We stood there for a moment, the forest eerily quiet, and then, faintly, I heard it. Jay. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it again, a soft, breathy whisper. Jay. Jay's grin faltered, and he looked around. Okay, who's messing with me? It's not us, Alex said, his voice barely audible. The whisper came again, closer this time. Jay. Let's go back, Sarah said, grabbing my arm. Jay was frozen, his flashlight shaking in his hand. This isn't funny, guys. We're not laughing, Emma snapped, pulling on his sleeve. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Asterisk, Jay. Turn around. Asterisk. Nope, I said, my heart pounding. Let's go. But Jay didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness. And then, slowly, he turned around. I don't know what he saw, but the scream that came out of him was like nothing I've ever heard. It was pure terror, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. He dropped his flashlight and bolted back toward the house, and we didn't waste any time following him. When we finally burst into Jay's living room, panting and pale, his mom looked up from the couch, alarmed. What happened? Are you kids okay? We all tried to talk at once, our words tumbling over each other in a chaotic mess. She's real, Jay finally said, his voice trembling. The Whispering Woman is real. For weeks after that night, Jay wasn't the same. He wouldn't talk about what he saw, and he avoided the woods entirely. He started sleeping with the lights on and jumped at every little noise. The rest of us tried to move on, but something about that night stayed with me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I hear a faint whisper. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. You ever hear of the shadow driver? I hadn't until the night it became the scariest story I'd ever lived. People say it's just one of those old urban legends, like something your uncle tells you around a campfire to keep you from driving too fast. But what happened to me wasn't just a story. I wish it was. It started a few months ago when I got my driver's license. My parents were super strict about the whole driving at night thing, but I finally convinced them to let me borrow the car one evening. I was just heading over to my friend Hannah's house for a movie night. Nothing wild. Her house was about 10 miles out of town, along this long, quiet highway that cut through a patch of forest. It was late October, and the air had that crisp, spooky vibe. Leaves were swirling everywhere, and the moon was huge, lighting up the road just enough to make the shadows even creepier. The legend goes like this. If you're driving alone on a deserted road at night and see a hitchhiker dressed all in black, don't stop. If you pick them up, you'll never make it to your destination. They'll lead you to some dark, unmarked road, and no one ever sees you again. If you don't pick them up, though, they'll follow you anyway. I didn't believe in urban legends like that. Who would? But then again, I wasn't exactly looking to find out if it was true, either. I was halfway to Hannah's when my radio started acting weird. One second, I was jamming to some pop song, and the next, it was static. I hit the button to switch stations, but every single one was just a wall of fuzz. Great, I muttered, fiddling with the knobs. That's when I saw it, the figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the headlights. It was off to the side of the road, standing perfectly still. It looked like a person, tall and thin, wrapped in what I thought was a long, black coat. I slowed down, my stomach twisting. I told myself it was probably just some lost traveler or a prankster trying to scare people. But as I got closer, I noticed something weird. The figure didn't move, not even a flinch. No shifting weight, no turning to look at my car. Just standing there, like a shadow glued to the ground. I kept driving, trying not to stare. But as I passed, I swore I saw a face under the hood. Pale, eyes wide open, watching me. I sped up, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It's nothing, I told myself. Just someone being creepy. But my heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. Then, a few miles down the road, I saw it again. The same figure. Same spot by the side of the road. Same eerie stillness. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding a little on the loose gravel. This time, I knew something wasn't right. There was no way they could have gotten there that fast. My breath was coming in short gasps as I stared at the figure. It felt like they were staring back, even though I couldn't make out their features. My brain was screaming at me to drive, to get as far away from this thing as possible. So I did. I floored it, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. My headlights cut through the darkness, but I couldn't stop glancing in my rearview mirror. And that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't by the road anymore. It was in the middle of the highway, standing there, perfectly still, directly behind my car. Except now it was closer. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I kept driving, telling myself it was just my imagination, just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. But every time I glanced in the mirror, it was there. Closer and closer, until I couldn't tell if it was standing still or moving. The trees thinned out as the highway approached a sharp bend. My tires squealed as I took the curve too fast, the back end of the car sliding for a moment before I regained control. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of relief. But then the figure was in front of me. I screamed, slamming on the brakes. The car lurched to a stop, the headlights illuminating the figure directly in the middle of the road. Only now, it wasn't still. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Its hood slipped back just enough to reveal part of its face, and my stomach dropped. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. And its eyes were black, like two empty pits staring straight into my soul. It raised a hand slowly, pointing at me. I panicked. My brain shut down, and instinct took over. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, like its gaze was a weight pressing down on my chest. I hit the gas, swerving to the side and speeding past it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't dare look back. The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't even remember how I got to Hannah's house. When I pulled into her driveway, I stumbled out of the car, shaking so badly I could barely stand. Hannah came running out, her face full of concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. All I could say was, "The shadow. It was on the road." For days after that, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. Its empty, black eyes. Its slow, deliberate movements. I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that my mind had just been playing tricks on me. But then, a week later, I heard the news. A car had been found abandoned on the same stretch of highway. The driver, a college student, was missing. The police had no leads, but witnesses claimed they'd seen a strange figure standing by the side of the road that night. The description matched exactly. I don't drive that road anymore. I avoid it like the plague. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think I hear the sound of footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know it's not. It started as just another boring family trip to my grandparents' cabin. The place was way out in the country, surrounded by fields and dense woods. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a rickety old radio that barely worked. My parents called it a peaceful getaway. I called it a nightmare. This time, though, my older cousin Nate was coming with us. He was 19 and a total adrenaline junkie. I figured at least he'd make things a little more interesting. The first night, as we sat around the fire pit roasting marshmallows, Nate decided to tell us about the red-eyed man. "Ever heard of him?" Nate asked, his face lit up by the flickering flames. "No," I said, rolling my eyes. Nate grinned. "He's this creepy urban legend around here. They say he's not really a man, more like a spirit or a demon or something. He roams the woods at night, looking for people who get too close to his territory. His eyes glow red, and if you see him, you're doomed." "Doomed how?" my little sister Chloe asked, her marshmallow falling into the fire. "They say he'll follow you, even if you run. He'll show up in your dreams, in your reflection, in the shadows. He never lets you go." "Nice story," I said, trying to sound unimpressed. "But that's all it is, a story." "Think so?" Nate said, leaning in closer. "Then why don't we go out to the woods tonight and prove it?" I knew it was a bad idea, but of course, Nate wouldn't shut up about it. And somehow, he convinced me and Chloe to tag along. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the trees, leaving my parents and grandparents by the fire. The woods were eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. Nate led the way, acting like he wasn't scared at all. Chloe stuck close to me, gripping my arm tightly. "Relax," I said, more to calm myself than her. "It's just some dumb story." But as we walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel uneasy. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways that didn't make sense. After about 15 minutes, Nate stopped. "This is it," he said, shining his flashlight around. "This is what?" I asked. "The spot where people say they've seen him," Nate replied. He turned off his flashlight and smirked. "Let's sit here for a while and see if he shows up." "Are you kidding me?" Chloe hissed. "Let's just go back." "Scared?" Nate teased. Chloe glared at him but didn't say anything. We sat down on a fallen log, the darkness pressing in around us. The woods felt alive, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. Nate started cracking jokes, and I was just about to tell him this was a waste of time when Chloe grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" "There," she said, pointing toward a cluster of trees. I squinted, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. At first, I thought she was imagining things, but then I saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes staring at us from the shadows. Nate laughed nervously. Okay, good one, Chloe. Did you plant something out here? Chloe shook her head, her face pale. I didn't do anything. It's real. The eyes didn't move. They just stared, unblinking, burning like tiny red coals in the blackness. Let's get out of here, I said, standing up, but Nate didn't move. It's probably just an animal, he said, though his voice wavered. I'm gonna check it out. Don't, Chloe and I said at the same time. But Nate was already walking toward the eyes, his flashlight bouncing with each step. As he got closer, the red eyes disappeared. Nate stopped, shining his flashlight around. See? Nothing here. You guys are just... His voice cut off, and he froze. Nate? I called out. He didn't respond. Then, without warning, he screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that made my blood turn to ice. He dropped his flashlight and bolted back toward us, his face twisted in terror. Run, he yelled. Just run. We didn't ask questions. We just ran, the darkness swallowing us as we sprinted back toward the cabin. Branches scratched at my arms and face, and the ground seemed to shift under my feet. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the underbrush. Heavy footsteps, faster than any human could move. Chloe tripped and fell, and I stopped to help her up. Come on, I shouted, pulling her to her feet. But when I looked back, I saw it. It wasn't a man. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed red, brighter than before, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing near the cabin, collapsing onto the grass. My parents and grandparents came running, their faces full of confusion and fear. What happened? My dad demanded. We saw something, Nate gasped, clutching his chest. Something with red eyes, Chloe added, tears streaming down her face. My grandparents exchanged a look, and my grandpa muttered something under his breath. What? I asked. He hesitated, then said, the red-eyed man. He's been haunting these woods for generations. That night, we barricaded ourselves in the cabin. No one slept. Every so often, we'd hear something outside, soft scratching at the windows, faint whispers carried on the wind. By morning, the noises stopped, but none of us felt safe. We packed up and left the cabin that day, cutting the trip short. My parents tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell they were shaken. It's been months since that night, but the red-eyed man hasn't left me. I see him in my dreams, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me with those burning red eyes. Sometimes, I wake up and think I hear footsteps outside my window. I don't go to the cabin anymore. None of us do. But I know he's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too close. There's a tunnel near my town, a long, narrow stretch of road that cuts through the side of a hill. Officially, it's called the Old Willard Tunnel, but no one uses that name. Everyone calls it the Whisper Tunnel. It's not on any of the main roads, and it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. But every kid in our town knows the story. It's one of those things you hear about on Halloween or at sleepovers, and it always starts the same way. If you drive through the Whisper Tunnel at midnight, you'll hear voices calling your name. But no matter what, you're not supposed to stop. If you stop, you'll never make it out. Most people laugh it off, like it's just another urban legend. But there are plenty of stories about people who disappeared there. Cars left abandoned in the middle of the tunnel, doors wide open, drivers gone without a trace. I used to think it was all made up, until the night we decided to test it. It was me, my best friend Eric, and his older brother Jake. Jake had just gotten a beat-up old Jeep and was obsessed with doing anything that screamed dangerous. Eric and I were mostly along for the ride, even if we knew half of Jake's ideas were terrible. That night, we were hanging out at Eric's house, bored out of our minds. Jake suddenly said, "Let's go to the Whisper Tunnel." Eric and I exchanged a look. "Why?" I asked. "To prove it's all fake," Jake said, smirking. "Come on, we'll drive through, honk the horn, and then nothing will happen. You'll see." Eric hesitated. "People have disappeared there, Jake." Jake rolled his eyes. "Yeah, people who were probably running away or drunk or something. It's not haunted." I wasn't sure I wanted to go, But Jake's teasing got to me. What's the matter? You scared? No, I lied. Let's do it. We left around 11:30, driving out of town and onto the old back roads. The farther we went, the darker it got. The streetlights disappeared, replaced by the pale glow of the moon. By the time we reached the tunnel, my stomach was a knot. It loomed ahead of us like a giant mouth. The blackness inside, so complete it seemed to swallow the light from our headlights. Jake pulled the Jeep to a stop just outside the entrance. "All right," he said, grinning. "Here we go." The second we entered the tunnel, the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, like stepping into a freezer. The sound of the tires echoed off the walls, a low, rumbling noise that made my skin crawl. Jake rolled down his window. "Hear anything yet?" he joked, his voice bouncing around us. "Shut up," Eric muttered, gripping the edge of his seat. I was sitting in the back, staring out the window. The walls of the tunnel were damp, streaked with dark patches that looked like water. Or maybe something else. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Jake kept driving, laughing at how tense we were. But then, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there. "Ryan." I froze. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Jake asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Someone said my name," I said, my voice shaking. Jake laughed. "Yeah, right." But then Eric spoke up. "I heard it too." Jake's grin faltered. "Okay, now you're messing with me." "I'm not." Eric snapped. The whispers grew louder. Asterisk Eric. Ryan. Asterisk. They seemed to come from everywhere. Behind us, above us, even from inside the car. "Turn around," I said, panic rising in my chest. "No way," Jake said, gripping the wheel. "We're almost through." But the tunnel didn't end. It felt like we'd been driving forever, the darkness stretching on and on. The headlights barely cut through it now, the walls of the tunnel almost invisible. And the whispers kept coming. "Jake, stop." Jake slammed his hand on the horn, the sound echoing like a scream. "Shut up," he yelled, though I wasn't sure if he was yelling at us or at the voices. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the lights went out. The headlights, the dashboard, everything. We were plunged into total darkness, the kind so deep it felt like drowning. "Jake," Eric shouted. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Jake yelled back, frantically twisting the keys in the ignition. That's when we saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark. They surrounded the car, red and unblinking, watching us. What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No one answered. The whispers returned, louder this time. "Get out, get out." The car shook, like something was pushing against it. The whispers turned into screams, a chorus of voices all shouting at once. Jake lost it. He threw open the door and bolted into the darkness. "Jake!" Eric screamed, but it was too late. The eyes turned, following him. One by one, they disappeared, as if chasing him into the void. Eric and I sat there, frozen, too terrified to move. The car stopped shaking, and the whispers faded into silence. "Do we go after him?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eric shook his head. "No, we need to get out of here." "But the car." He grabbed the keys, twisting them again. This time, the engine roared to life, and the headlights flickered back on. Eric didn't wait. He floored it, the tires screeching as we sped forward. The tunnel finally ended, spilling us out onto the open road. We didn't stop, not until we were back at Eric's house. We never found Jake. The police searched the tunnel and the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of him. His Jeep was still running, parked in Eric's driveway. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes in the dark, staring at me. Sometimes, I think I hear whispers when I'm alone, and sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see a figure standing by the side of the road. It looks like Jake, but his eyes are red. There's a story they tell at my school, one of those whispered rumors that feels like it's been around forever. Everyone calls her the girl in the reflection. According to the legend, if you're alone at night and look into a mirror long enough, you'll see her. She doesn't look like you. Not exactly. At first, she might seem like your reflection, but there's always something wrong. Her eyes might be too wide, her smile too sharp, or her movements just slightly out of sync. And once you see her, she sees you too. I'd heard the story a dozen times. Some people said it was all nonsense, just a way to creep out freshmen. Others swore it was real, that they'd seen her themselves but wouldn't talk about what happened after. I didn't believe in stuff like that. Ghosts, urban legends, they were fun to talk about, but that's all they were. Or at least, that's what I thought. One night, I was up late working on a history project. It was one of those nights where the whole house was so quiet it felt like the walls were holding their breath. My parents were out of town, and my little brother was staying with our aunt, so it was just me. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. My room felt stuffy, so I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. The mirror over the sink was old, the edges speckled with black spots where the silver backing had worn away. I remember staring at my reflection, tired and pale under the harsh fluorescent light. That's when I thought about the story. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a dumb legend. Or maybe I was just tired and curious. I turned off the bathroom light and stood in front of the mirror. The room was pitch black except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. I could barely see my reflection, just the faint outline of my face. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I stared at the mirror, feeling ridiculous. But then, I noticed something. My reflection wasn't moving. I tilted my head to the left. It stayed still. My heart started pounding as I leaned in closer, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't me. Her eyes were too dark, like black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth was curved into a faint, unnatural smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. I stumbled back, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The light came on, flooding the room with brightness. My reflection was normal again. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. Just my imagination, I muttered, splashing water on my face. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, just the story getting to me. But the house felt different now, heavier, like I wasn't alone anymore. I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me. I locked it, something I never usually did, and crawled into bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in the mirror. Her dark eyes, her too wide smile. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft tapping sound. It was coming from my mirror. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was on the other side, knocking to be let in. I pulled the covers up to my chin, my heart racing. The tapping stopped. Then, I heard a whisper. "Come closer." I shook my head, squeezing my eyes shut. "It's not real," I whispered to myself. "It's not real." But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Come closer." I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. The room felt colder, the air heavy with something I couldn't explain. Then, the whisper changed. "Why won't you look at me?" I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of bed, grabbing my blanket like it could somehow protect me, and ran to the corner of the room, as far from the mirror as I could get. But no matter how much I tried to avoid it, I could still feel her, watching, waiting. I stayed there until the first light of dawn began creeping through my window. The whispers stopped, and the tapping faded into silence. When I finally worked up the courage to glance at the mirror, it was empty. But something was wrong. The faint outline of a handprint was pressed against the glass, right where I'd heard the tapping. I didn't touch the mirror. I couldn't. Instead, I threw a blanket over it, blocking it from view. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. I knew they'd just think I was crazy or making it up, but I wasn't the only one who'd seen her. A week later, I overheard two girls in the hallway talking about the girl in the reflection. One of them said her cousin had seen her once, years ago, and had refused to have mirrors in her house ever since. She said the girl followed her. One of the girls whispered, everywhere she went, she'd see her. In windows, in puddles, even in her phone screen. I felt sick. That night, I covered every reflective surface in my room. My mirror, my phone, even the tiny glass pane on my alarm clock. But it didn't help. I started seeing her everywhere. It would happen in the strangest places. A passing car window, a darkened TV screen, always just for a moment, just long enough for me to see her too wide smile and dark, empty eyes. The worst part was, she was getting closer. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at me with that horrible smile. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, she leaned in, her face inches from mine. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered. The next morning, I smashed every mirror in the house. But deep down, I knew it was too late. Once you see her, she never lets you go. I'd never believed in ghosts, curses, or urban legends. They were fun to talk about, sure, but I didn't buy into the idea that something supernatural was out there, lurking in the dark. That changed last summer when I heard about the shadow train. There's an old railroad track on the edge of our town, one that hasn't been used in decades. The tracks are rusty, overgrown with weeds, and the station is falling apart, covered in graffiti. People say if you stand on the tracks at night, you'll hear the sound of a train whistle echoing in the distance. But the thing is, no trains run there anymore. The legend goes like this. Years ago, a passenger train derailed on those tracks, killing everyone on board. Ever since, the shadow train roams the line at night, carrying the lost souls of the passengers. If you see it, you're supposed to turn away and run. If you don't, you might end up becoming part of the train's crew. I heard about it from my friend Lucas. He was obsessed with creepy stories and haunted places. "We have to check it out," he said one night while we were hanging out at his house. "Why?" I asked, shaking my head. "It's just a dumb story. You're just scared," Lucas teased. I rolled my eyes. "I'm not scared. It's just pointless." But Lucas wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about it, daring me to go with him. Eventually, I gave in. We decided to go on a Saturday night, just after midnight. It was me, Lucas, and his cousin Haley, who was just as curious as he was. We grabbed flashlights and headed out, biking to the old railroad tracks. The air was heavy and humid, the kind of summer night where even the slightest breeze feels like a relief. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the abandoned tracks as we walked. "This is it," Lucas said when we reached the station. The building was a crumbling mess, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. Graffiti covered the walls, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and rust. "Creepy," Haley muttered, shining her flashlight around. "Let's just stay for a few minutes and then go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We walked along the tracks, the gravel crunching under our feet. The night was eerily quiet, except for the occasional chirp of crickets or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Do you hear anything?" Lucas asked after a while. "No," I said, relieved. "See? Nothing's." I stopped mid-sentence. Faintly, in the distance, I heard it. A low, mournful whistle. Haley froze, her flashlight beam shaking. "Is that?" "It's just the wind," I said quickly, though I wasn't so sure. But then the ground beneath us began to tremble, just slightly at first, like a soft vibration. Lucas grinned, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's real." "Let's go," I said, grabbing his arm. "No way." Lucas pulled away, walking toward the sound. "Lucas, stop," Haley called after him, but he didn't listen. The whistle grew louder, echoing through the night. The vibrations beneath our feet turned into a steady rumble. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, like headlights piercing through the darkness. But as it got closer, the shape of the train began to emerge. It was massive, its black body gleaming like polished metal. Smoke billowed from its chimney, curling into the sky like dark tendrils. The windows glowed faintly, and inside, shadowy figures moved back and forth. Haley grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't possible," she whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Lucas stood in the middle of the tracks, staring at the approaching train with a mix of awe and fear. "Lucas," I shouted, "Get off the tracks." But he didn't move. The train was close now, so close I could see the faces of the figures inside. Only, they weren't normal faces. They were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They pressed against the windows, staring at us with expressions that were equal parts sorrow and hunger. "Lucas!" Haley screamed. At the last second, I lunged forward, grabbing Lucas and pulling him off the tracks. The train roared past us, its wheels screeching against the metal rails. The sound was deafening, and the air around us felt electric, like a storm was about to break. But as the train sped by, something strange happened. The cars never ended. It was like the train went on forever, one car after another filled with shadowy passengers. "I can't," Lucas stammered, staring at the endless train. "I can't look away." I grabbed his face, forcing him to look at me. "Snap out of it." Haley was crying now, her flashlight flickering as she backed away from the tracks. "This isn't real," she kept saying over and over. But it was real. The train slowed, its wheels grinding against the tracks. One of the doors slid open, revealing a dark interior lit by a dim, flickering light. "Don't look," I said, pulling Haley and Lucas back. But Lucas wouldn't budge. "They're calling me," he whispered. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Don't you hear them?" Lucas said, his eyes wide and glassy. "They're calling my name." Before I could stop him, Lucas stepped forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Lucas, no," I yelled, grabbing his arm. But he pulled away, walking toward the open door of the train. The shadowy figures inside reached out, their hands pale and skeletal. "Lucas!" Haley screamed, but it was no use. He stepped onto the train, and the door slammed shut behind him. The train began to move again, picking up speed as it disappeared into the darkness. "Lucas!" I shouted, running after it, but it was gone. The tracks were empty, the night silent once more. Haley and I stood there, shaking and terrified. "What just happened?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. We went to the police, but they didn't believe us. They said Lucas probably ran away, though they couldn't explain the strange scorch marks on the tracks or the lingering smell of smoke. For weeks, Haley and I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces in the train windows, their hollow eyes staring back at me. One night, I heard the whistle again. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was there. And in the distance, I saw the faint glow of headlights. The shadow train was coming back. This time, it was coming for me. In the old part of our school, the one no one really uses anymore, there's a door at the end of the hallway that's painted bright red. It stands out, stark against the faded gray walls and dusty windows. Everyone calls it the red door. You'd think it was locked or sealed shut, but it's not. Anyone could open it if they wanted to, but no one does. There's an urban legend about it, passed down from class to class. The story goes that years ago, a teacher vanished from our school without a trace. She was last seen walking into the old wing, near the red door. Some say she went inside and was never seen again. Others claim she didn't leave of her own free will. The legend gets weirder from there. People say the red door is a portal to somewhere else. Not another room, but another world. A darker one. The few students brave, or stupid, enough to open it claim the same thing. Inside, there's nothing but a staircase spiraling down into darkness. If you go down too far, you won't come back. I didn't believe the story. Not at first. I'd walked by that door a dozen times during freshman year, and nothing weird ever happened. It was just an old door, chipped and scuffed from years of neglect. But last month, something changed. It started when my friend Max dared me to open it. We were hanging out after school, killing time while waiting for his mom to pick us up. The old wing was quiet, empty except for the faint hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the floorboards. "Let's check it out," Max said, grinning. "Why?" I asked, already uneasy. "Because no one else will," he said. "Come on, aren't you curious?" I wasn't, but Max could be pretty convincing when he wanted to be. We reached the door, standing at the very end of the dim hallway. Up close, it looked different. The paint wasn't just red. It seemed wet, like it had been freshly coated. I reached out to touch it, half expecting to feel sticky paint under my fingers, but it was dry. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Max nodded, his grin fading into something more serious. "Let's just take a quick look. If it's nothing, we'll leave." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into the dark. Max shined his phone's flashlight into the void, but the beam only reached a few steps before being swallowed by the shadows. "See," he said, nudging me. "It's just a staircase." "Yeah," I muttered, my stomach churning. "A creepy staircase that goes who knows where." Max stepped inside, his sneakers echoing against the concrete steps. "Come on," he said, waving me forward. "Just a quick look." I didn't want to follow him, but the thought of standing alone in that hallway felt even worse. The air grew colder as we descended, the temperature dropping with each step. The walls were damp, and the smell of mildew grew stronger the deeper we went. "Do you hear that?" Max asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Hear what?" He tilted his head, listening. "It's like whispering." I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. "You're imagining things," I said, my voice trembling. But Max shook his head. "No, listen." This time, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like someone muttering just out of earshot. "Let's go back," I said, panic rising in my chest. But Max ignored me, moving further down the staircase. "It's probably just the pipes or something." "Pipes don't whisper," I snapped, grabbing his arm. He shrugged me off. "Don't be such a wuss. We're almost there." "Almost where?" He didn't answer. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a small, circular room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. They looked old, older than the school itself, and they glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was a large, circular mirror propped against the far wall. Its surface was dark, like black glass, and something about it made my skin crawl. "Whoa," Max whispered, stepping closer. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice trembling. But Max was already reaching out. The moment his fingers brushed the surface of the mirror, the room seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around us, though there was no one else there. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a strange, red light, and the air grew heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "Max, we need to go," I said, backing toward the staircase. But Max didn't move. He was staring into the mirror, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Max," I shouted, grabbing his shoulder. He turned to me, and I froze. His eyes weren't his anymore. They were black, completely void of color, and his face was twisted into an expression I'd never seen before. Fear, pain, and something else, something I couldn't name. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice low and hollow. "Who?" I asked, my heart pounding, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, his body rigid and unnatural, and pointed at the mirror. "They're here." The surface of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. Then, something stepped out. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in shadow that seemed to writhe and twist like smoke. Its eyes glowed red, and its hands ended in long, claw-like fingers that scraped against the stone floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing tilted its head, studying us. Then it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Max screamed, a sound that echoed in my ears long after it stopped. The creature moved toward him, its shadowy form stretching and twisting as it closed the distance. I wanted to help him, to pull him away, but my legs wouldn't move. "Run," Max choked out, his voice barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic with each step. When I reached the top, I slammed the red door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The hallway was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. But Max was gone. I told the principal, the police, anyone who would listen, but no one believed me. They said Max must have run away, that he'd probably show up in a few days. But I knew the truth. I haven't been back to the old wing since that night. I avoid the red door at all costs, even crossing to the other side of the building if I have to. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers. And when I look in the mirror, I see shadows that don't belong to me. It's strange how something as ordinary as a forest can feel so different at night. During the day, the woods near my house are peaceful. A place where kids play, people walk their dogs, and the sun filters through the trees in golden rays. But after sunset, it changes. The trees seem taller, their branches twisting together like skeletal arms. Shadows stretch longer, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves are replaced by an eerie silence. People say it's just your imagination playing tricks on you, but I know better. There's an old legend about these woods, the kind of story you'd hear around a campfire. They call it the Watcher. It's said that years ago, a hermit lived in the forest. No one knows his name or where he came from, but the townsfolk avoided him. He was strange, they said, always mumbling to himself and carving symbols into the trees. Some claimed he practiced dark rituals, summoning things that shouldn't exist. One day, the hermit vanished. His cabin burned to the ground, and no one ever saw him again. But people who ventured too deep into the woods began to report strange occurrences. Footsteps when no one was there, whispers carried on the wind, and the feeling of being watched. Some say the hermit never really left. Others think he succeeded in summoning something, and now, whatever it is, it watches anyone who dares to enter the woods at night. I never paid much attention to the stories. They were just that, stories. I'd hiked those trails 100 times and never saw anything unusual. That all changed one night last fall. My best friend Ethan and I had been hanging out at his house, playing video games until way too late. By the time I decided to head home, it was close to midnight. Ethan offered to walk me back, but I told him not to bother. It was only a 15-minute walk through the woods, and I'd done it 100 times before. "You sure?" he asked, standing in the doorway as I slipped on my jacket. "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "What's the worst that could happen?" He laughed. "Just don't let the Watcher get you." I rolled my eyes. "Right. I'll see you tomorrow." The trail through the woods was barely visible in the moonlight, but I knew it well. The air was cold, the kind of crisp autumn chill that makes your breath fog. Leaves crunched under my boots as I walked, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. At first, everything seemed normal, but about halfway through, I started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I stopped, turning to look behind me. The trail was empty, the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. Shaking my head, I laughed nervously. "Get it together," I muttered, continuing down the path. But the feeling didn't go away. A few minutes later, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I froze, my heart pounding. "Ethan?" I called, hoping he'd followed me as a joke. No response. The rustling grew louder, coming from somewhere to my left. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just branches and leaves illuminated in the dim beam. But then, something moved. It was quick, darting between the trees so fast I almost didn't catch it. A shadow, darker than the night, slipping just out of sight. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Silence. I took a step back, gripping my flashlight tightly. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, or some late-night hiker. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. The rustling started again, this time from my right. I spun around, shining the light in the direction of the sound. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. And then I saw them. Eyes. Two glowing eyes, staring at me from between the trees. They weren't like animal eyes. They were too big, too human. But they weren't human either. They glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I took another step back, my legs trembling. "Stay away," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The eyes didn't move. They just watched me, unblinking. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. It could have been seconds or minutes. But then, the eyes disappeared, fading into the darkness like they were never there. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the trail. The woods seemed different now, the trees closing in around me. The path that had always felt so familiar twisted and turned in ways I didn't recognize. And the footsteps, they were following me. No matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me, keeping pace. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods, the faint glow of the streetlights in the distance. I burst out of the trees, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I was safely inside my house. I locked the door, my hands shaking, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. And when I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of the woods, dark and endless, with whispers all around me. The next day, I told Ethan what had happened. At first, he thought I was joking. But when he saw how serious I was, his expression changed. "You saw the Watcher," he said quietly. I shook my head. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been. Ethan didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. I avoid the trail completely, even during the day. But sometimes, when I'm outside at night, I feel that same cold, watching presence. And when I look into the shadows, I swear I see those glowing eyes staring back at me. Growing up, I lived in a small town surrounded by endless fields and dense woods. It was a quiet place where nothing much ever happened, except for the stories about the midnight train. The legend went like this. If you walked along the abandoned railway tracks at night, you might hear the faint whistle of a train. But it wasn't an ordinary train. It was said to be a ghost train, doomed to travel forever. The passengers? People who disappeared mysteriously over the years. The train would stop if it saw you, the story claimed, and if you boarded it, you'd never be seen again. I'd heard the tale 100 times growing up. Everyone in town knew someone who swore they'd heard the whistle or seen the faint glow of the train in the distance. My parents used to warn me not to go near the tracks at night, but I never believed the stories. At least, not until last summer. It was late July, and my friends and I were bored. Small town boredom hits differently, especially when you're 17 and there's nothing to do but hang out in someone's basement or wander around aimlessly. That night, we decided to do something different, something daring. "Let's go to the tracks," Mia suggested, her eyes glinting with excitement. "The tracks?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You know, the midnight train thing," she said. "Let's see if it's real." We all laughed nervously, but no one said no. There were 4 of us, Mia, her boyfriend Chris, my best friend Sam, and me. Armed with flashlights and a couple of snacks, we set out just before midnight. The old railway line was about a mile from my house, a rusted path cutting through the woods like a forgotten scar. By the time we got there, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over everything. The tracks were overgrown with weeds, the metal rails slick with rust. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed muffled, like the woods were holding their breath. "This is so stupid," Chris muttered, kicking a loose rock down the tracks. "Scared already?" Mia teased, nudging him. "Yeah, right," he said, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We started walking along the tracks, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. At first, it was almost fun, like a late-night adventure. We joked and laughed, trying to scare each other with exaggerated ghost stories. But as the minutes ticked by, the mood shifted. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. Every little sound, a twig snapping, a leaf falling, made us jump. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. We all froze, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, faintly, I caught it. A distant, mournful whistle. "It's just the wind," Chris said quickly, though his voice wavered. "Doesn't sound like the wind," Mia whispered, her hand tightening around her flashlight. We kept walking, the sound growing louder with each step. And then, in the distance, we saw it. A faint, flickering light hovering just above the tracks. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. No one answered. We just stood there, staring as the light grew brighter, closer. The ground beneath us began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew stronger with each passing second. "It's a train," Sam said, his eyes wide. "But that's impossible. The tracks are abandoned." "Maybe it's some old maintenance train," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. But deep down, we all knew what it was. The train emerged from the darkness, its sleek black cars gleaming in the moonlight. It didn't look old or rusted like I'd imagined. Instead, it was pristine, almost too perfect, like it didn't belong in this world. The windows were dark, but I felt like someone, or something, was watching us from inside. It slowed as it approached, the whistle piercing the night. "Run," I said, my voice trembling. But no one moved. The train came to a stop just a few feet away, its massive engine hissing and steaming. The door to one of the cars slid open with a creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading inside. "Don't," I said, grabbing Mia's arm as she took a step forward. But she shook me off, her face pale and dazed. "I just want to see," she murmured. "Mia, no," Chris shouted, but she was already climbing the stairs. The moment her foot touched the top step, something changed. The air grew colder, and the light from our flashlights flickered and died. The train seemed to hum with an energy that made my skin crawl. "Mia, get back here," I yelled, but it was too late. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the train began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster. "Mia!" Chris screamed, running alongside the train, but it was no use. The cars blurred as they sped past, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. And then, just like that, it was gone. We stood there, stunned, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. "What just happened?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. Chris didn't answer. He just stared down the empty tracks, his fists clenched. "We have to tell someone," I said finally, though I wasn't sure who would believe us. The next day, we went to the police. We told them everything, about the train, about Mia. They didn't believe us, of course. They said she probably ran away, that maybe we'd been drinking or playing some elaborate prank. But we knew the truth. A week later, I found something strange in my mailbox. It was an old photograph, black and white, with faded edges. It showed a group of people standing on a train platform, their faces blank and expressionless. And there, in the middle of the group, was Mia. I don't go near the tracks anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance, and I wonder if Mia is still out there, riding the midnight train, forever lost in its endless journey. When I was younger, I had an irrational fear of mirrors. Not the regular kind, like bathroom mirrors or the one in my bedroom. No, what terrified me were those old, ornate mirrors, the ones with heavy wooden frames and glass that seemed to hold more than just your reflection. My grandmother had one of those mirrors. It hung in her living room, its tarnished gold frame carved with intricate designs. The glass was slightly warped, and no matter where you stood, it felt like the reflection was just a little off. My mom always called it beautiful. I thought it was creepy. Grandma used to say the mirror was special, that it had been in the family for generations. She'd tell me stories about how it was made by some artisan in the 1800s who believed mirrors could trap spirits. She thought it was a good thing, a way to protect us, but I never liked that mirror. And after what happened, I'll never look into one the same way again. It all started last winter when my grandmother passed away. She'd been in good health, or so we thought. One morning, my mom got a call from her neighbor saying she hadn't come out to get the mail. When they went to check, they found her sitting in her favorite chair, staring at the mirror. The doctors said it was a heart attack, quick and painless, but something about it didn't sit right with me. A week later, we went to her house to start cleaning things out. It was strange being there without her. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The mirror was still there, hanging on the wall like always. Should we take it down? I asked as we packed boxes of books and knickknacks. My mom shook her head. It's part of the estate. We'll figure out what to do with it later. That night, I stayed at my grandma's house with my mom. We planned to finish packing the next day, and driving back late didn't seem worth it. I slept in the guest room, but the layout of the house made it impossible to avoid the mirror. It hung at the end of the hallway, its surface catching just enough light to reflect faintly in the dark. I tried not to look at it, but every time I passed, I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. At around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the creak of the old house settling, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone knocking lightly on glass. My heart pounded as I crept out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was dark, but the tapping was louder now. It was coming from the mirror. I froze, gripping the doorknob. My instincts screamed at me to go back to bed, to ignore it, but something compelled me to move closer. When I was a few feet away, the tapping stopped. The hallway was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I stared at the mirror, its surface faintly reflecting the dim light from the nightlight plugged in down the hall. For a moment, nothing happened, and then I saw it. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but it wasn't. It looked like me, same height, same face, but the eyes were wrong. They were darker, deeper, like two endless pits, and the expression wasn't mine. It was twisted into a cold, cruel smile. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The thing in the mirror tilted its head, mimicking my movement but slower, almost mockingly. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made my skin crawl. When morning finally came, I told my mom what I'd seen. She laughed it off, saying it was just a nightmare. "You've always had an overactive imagination," she said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. But I knew it wasn't my imagination. We left my grandma's house that afternoon, but the mirror stayed. My mom said she'd arrange for someone to pick it up later. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get out of there. I thought leaving would make things better, that whatever I'd seen in that mirror would stay behind. I was wrong. A week later, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. Objects not being where I left them, cold spots in random parts of the house. But then, the dreams started. In the dreams, I was standing in front of the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine. It was the same twisted version of me, its dark eyes staring into mine. It would reach out, its hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. I'd always wake up sweating, my heart racing. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom mirror fogged up, like someone had breathed on it. In the center, there was a single handprint. I tried telling my mom, but she just shrugged it off, saying I was still grieving and imagining things. But Sam, my best friend, believed me. "Have you thought about getting rid of your mirrors?" he asked one afternoon. "I can't," I said. It's following me. No matter where I go, it's there." Sam suggested doing some research on the mirror. Maybe there was a way to break whatever connection it had to me. We started digging, and what we found sent chills down my spine. The artisan who made the mirror wasn't just a craftsman. He was an occultist. He believed that mirrors were portals, capable of connecting our world to others. Some articles claimed that his mirrors were cursed, that they acted as traps for spirits, but others said they could also let things out. Sam and I decided to go back to my grandma's house to destroy the mirror. Armed with a crowbar and a hammer, we snuck in late at night. The house was colder than I remembered, and the silence was oppressive. The mirror hung in its usual spot, looking just as ominous as ever. As we approached, the temperature dropped even further. My breath fogged in front of me, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I raised the crowbar, ready to smash the glass, but before I could, the surface rippled. It was like watching a stone drop into a still pond. The reflection distorted, and then the twisted version of me appeared, its smile wider than ever. It pressed its hands against the glass, and I swear I heard it whisper, "Let me out." I froze, unable to move. Sam grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Do it," he yelled. I swung the crowbar as hard as I could. The glass shattered, the sound deafening in the quiet house. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a gust of icy wind rushed past us, and the lights flickered. When it was over, the mirror was nothing but shards on the floor. The oppressive feeling in the air lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. We left the house without looking back. Since that night, I haven't seen the twisted reflection again. But I still avoid mirrors, especially old ones, because now I know the truth. Sometimes, the things we see in the mirror aren't reflections. There's something else. When I was a kid, my family would take weekend trips to my uncle's cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. The cabin was old, rustic, and completely isolated. No cell service, no neighbors for miles. At the time, I thought it was magical. I loved the quiet, the towering pines, and the endless trails to explore. But there was one rule my uncle always emphasized: never go into the woods after dark. He said it with a seriousness that made my parents nod gravely, but never offered much explanation. When I asked him why, he simply said, "That's when the woods come alive." It was an odd thing to say, but I figured it was just his way of scaring a 10-year-old. My uncle was full of old tales, like the one about the deer that walked on two legs, or the laughter you'd sometimes hear when you were alone. "Don't listen to him," my dad told me. "He's just trying to mess with you." For years, I believed that. Until last summer. I was 17, and we'd returned to the cabin for the first time in years. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and my dad wanted to keep the place in good condition. The cabin hadn't changed much. Same creaky floors, same musty smell, and the same woods stretching endlessly in every direction. I was excited to be back, though I wasn't a kid anymore. I spent most of the day scrolling on my phone and taking pictures of the trees while my parents cleaned and repaired the cabin. That night, after dinner, my dad went to bed early, leaving me and my mom to sit by the fire. The night was unusually quiet. No crickets, no wind rustling the trees. Just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Do you remember the stories Uncle Joe used to tell about the woods?" I asked, poking at the fire with a stick. My mom smiled faintly. "Oh, he loved those old legends. They're just stories, though. Don't let them get in your head." But they were already in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about them. The strange laughter, the walking deer, the whispers Uncle Joe used to mention. After my mom went to bed, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I told myself I wasn't scared, that I was too old to believe in ghost stories. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the flashlight I carried. I wandered down the path leading away from the cabin, the gravel crunching under my sneakers. The further I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent. No owls, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just my footsteps and the sound of my breathing. I stopped, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal much, just endless trunks and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Help." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it came from deeper in the woods. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response, but then the whisper came again, this time a little louder. "Help me." Every instinct told me to turn around and go back to the cabin, but something about the voice drew me in. It sounded like a woman, scared and desperate. I took a few cautious steps forward, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Where are you?" I asked. The voice didn't answer, but I heard movement, soft footsteps, just ahead. I followed the sound, weaving through the trees. The ground became uneven, the roots twisting like gnarled fingers. The deeper I went, the colder it got, and the air felt heavier, like the woods were closing in around me. Finally, I reached a small clearing. In the center stood a figure, a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her back to me. Her hair was long and matted, and her shoulders trembled as if she was crying. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her head bowed. I took a step closer, and the beam of my flashlight flickered. "Miss?" I said, my voice shaking. That's when she turned around. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, they weren't right. They were too big, too dark, like twin voids staring into my soul. Her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, and she let out a laugh, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to her. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. She took a step toward me, and as she moved, her form flickered, like an old TV struggling to hold a signal. "Stay away," I yelled, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She didn't stop. I turned and ran, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I bolted through the woods. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, but I didn't dare look back. The whispers followed me. "Come back, stay, join us." The voices overlapped, growing louder and more distorted. They didn't sound human anymore. I finally reached the path leading to the cabin and burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. My mom and dad rushed out of their room, startled by the noise. "What's going on?" my dad asked, his face pale. I could barely speak, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Something in the woods." They didn't ask questions. My dad locked the doors and windows, and we stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, huddled together in silence. The next morning, we packed up and left. On the drive home, my mom tried to convince me it was just a bad dream or my imagination, but I knew better. A few days later, I found an old journal among my uncle's belongings. It was filled with notes about the woods, legends, sightings, and warnings. One passage stood out. "They whisper to you when they're hungry. If you follow the voices, they'll never let you leave." I haven't been back to the cabin since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers outside my window, and I wonder if the woods have found me after all. Growing up in the small mountain town of Ridgepoint, there wasn't much to do. Everyone knew everyone, and most weekends were spent around bonfires or hiking the endless forest trails. But the one thing nobody ever did, at least, not if they were smart, was venture near the old mining ridge after sundown. The ridge was steeped in legend. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the miners who'd worked there over a century ago, back when the town was booming. According to him, an accident had trapped over 20 men deep in the mine. Rescue teams worked for days, but the tunnels were unstable. Eventually, they called off the search, leaving the men entombed in the mountain. But the miners didn't rest. "Sometimes they come down from the ridge," Grandpa would say, his voice low and serious. "Not as men anymore, but as something else. They're the watchers now, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." As a kid, I ate those stories up, even though they scared the life out of me. By the time I hit my teens, I'd mostly dismissed them as ghost tales meant to keep kids out of danger. Mostly. It wasn't until the summer of my junior year that I started to think maybe there was more truth to the stories than anyone liked to admit. My best friends, Alex and Mia, were thrill seekers. They lived for anything that got their adrenaline pumping. Urban exploring, cliff diving, you name it. So, when Alex suggested we spend a night camping near the ridge, Mia was all in. "I don't know," I said, hesitating. "You've heard the stories." Alex rolled his eyes. "Come on, Nate. You don't really believe that stuff, do you? It's just old miners trying to scare kids." "Yeah," Mia chimed in, grinning. "Besides, it'll be fun. We'll make a fire, tell some ghost stories, and prove the watchers aren't real." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We packed our gear and set out on a warm Friday evening, hiking the narrow trail that wound up the ridge. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By the time we reached the clearing near the old mine entrance, the sky had turned a deep orange. The mine itself was sealed off with rusted iron bars, a sign warning of unstable tunnels. The clearing was small but flat, surrounded by dense pines that swayed gently in the evening breeze. "This is perfect," Mia said, dropping her backpack. Alex set up the fire while Mia and I pitched the tent. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, and an uneasy silence settled over the ridge. We sat around the fire, eating s'mores and joking about the legends. Alex told a ridiculous story about the Watchers being radioactive mutants, while Mia laughed and said they were probably just bears people mistook for ghosts. I tried to join in, but something about the night felt off. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. Around midnight, Alex decided he wanted to check out the mine entrance. "Are you serious?" I asked, staring at him like he'd lost his mind. "Why not?" he said, grabbing his flashlight. "It's not like we're going in. I just want to see it up close." Mia shrugged. "I'll go with you." "What about you, Nate?" I hesitated, glancing toward the dark outline of the mine in the distance. "I'll stay here. Someone should watch the fire." They left, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they made their way toward the mine. I stayed by the fire, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But as the minutes dragged on, the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around me. It sounded almost like whispers, soft, indistinct voices carried on the breeze. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard something else. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, crunching through the underbrush. "Alex? Mia?" I called, standing up and shining my flashlight toward the sound. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was Alex and Mia, but something about them was wrong. They were too tall, their limbs too thin and elongated. Their faces were shadowed, but I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking and cold. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching. Suddenly, a scream tore through the night. It was Mia's voice, coming from the direction of the mine. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the sound, leaving the fire behind. As I neared the mine entrance, I found Alex and Mia huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing. "There was someone in the mine," Mia stammered. "We saw them, or it—" Alex nodded, his hands trembling. "It wasn't human, Nate. It was— I don't know what it was." I shined my flashlight toward the mine entrance. The beam illuminated the rusted bars and the darkness beyond. For a moment, there was nothing. And then I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It pressed against the bars, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. "Leave," it whispered, the word barely audible but filled with malice. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran back to the campsite, grabbed our gear, and bolted down the trail as fast as we could. The whole way, we could hear footsteps behind us, soft but deliberate, as if something was following us, herding us away from the ridge. When we finally reached the base of the mountain, the footsteps stopped. We didn't stop running until we reached Alex's truck. None of us slept that night. The next morning, we told my dad what had happened. He listened quietly, his expression grave. When we finished, he sighed and shook his head. "Your uncle always said there were things on that ridge that weren't meant to be disturbed," he said. "I think you kids found out he was right. We never went back to the ridge after that. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the Watchers. Those figures standing at the edge of the firelight, their hollow eyes staring into mine. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to ignore the warnings." Growing up, my grandmother always had a thing about mirrors. She believed they were portals, gateways to something beyond our world. Her house was filled with old superstitions, covering mirrors during storms, never letting a mirror reflect another mirror, and most importantly, never staring into one for too long, especially at night. I used to roll my eyes at her warnings. I thought it was just another one of her eccentricities, like her insistence on salting windowsills or her refusal to sleep in complete darkness. But that was before I met the Mirror Man. It started last year, when my family moved into an old Victorian house in a small, quiet town. My dad had inherited the place from an uncle I'd never met, and though it was a bit run down, we were excited to have a fresh start. The house was massive, with creaky wooden floors, a sprawling attic, and mirrors in almost every room. Most of them were antique, their silvered surfaces tarnished with age. At first, I thought the mirrors were beautiful, but there was something unsettling about them, too. They seemed to catch reflections that didn't quite match the room. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and sometimes I felt like I wasn't alone when I looked into one. My younger brother, Liam, was the first to notice something strange. "Do you ever feel like the mirrors are watching us?" he asked one night as we were brushing our teeth. I laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies." But he didn't laugh back. "I'm serious, Ella. Sometimes I see things in them. Things that aren't me." I shrugged it off, but after that, I started paying more attention to the mirrors. And it wasn't long before I noticed it too. It was subtle at first. Just little things, like my reflection holding an expression a second too long after I turned away, or shadows shifting in the background when nothing in the room had moved. Then one night, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I glanced at the mirror across the room. It was a tall, ornate thing with a gilded frame, positioned so I could see the reflection of my bed. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as I looked closer, I realized there was something wrong with my reflection. It wasn't moving. I sat up, my heart pounding, and watched as the version of me in the mirror slowly turned its head to look directly at me. Its eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too empty, and its smile was twisted, almost hungry. I screamed, scrambling out of bed, and the reflection snapped back to normal. My parents rushed into the room, their faces filled with concern. "What happened?" my mom asked, her voice frantic. I hesitated, unsure how to explain what I'd seen. I thought I saw something in the mirror." They chalked it up to stress and told me to get some sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The next few days were a blur of unease. Liam refused to go near any of the mirrors, and I couldn't blame him. Every time I passed one, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just the reflections, either. At night, I started hearing faint tapping sounds, like fingernails on glass, coming from the mirrors in my room. And then Liam disappeared. It happened on a Friday night. We'd been watching a movie in the living room, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch. When I woke up, the house was silent, and Liam was gone. I called for him, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. My parents joined in, their panic growing with every passing minute. Finally, I went up to his room. The first thing I noticed was the mirror on his wall. It was cracked, a jagged line splitting the glass down the middle. And in the center of the crack was a smudge, like a handprint pressed against the inside of the glass. I froze, staring at the mirror as a cold dread settled over me. Then I heard it, a faint, distant voice calling my name. "Ella." It was coming from the mirror. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged, as the voice came again. "Ella, help me." It was Liam. I screamed for my parents, but when they came into the room, the voice was gone. They thought I was losing it, but I knew what I'd heard. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the mirror across from my bed. The tapping sounds had returned, louder now, more insistent. And then I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark figure standing behind my reflection. But as I watched, it stepped closer, its form becoming clearer. The mirror man. He was tall and impossibly thin, his limbs too long and his movements jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. His face was pale and featureless, except for a wide, gaping mouth that stretched into a grotesque smile. He raised one hand and tapped on the glass, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Come closer," he whispered, his voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The mirror man tilted his head, his smile widening. "Bring him back," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. "Give me my brother." He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a bony finger and pointed to the center of the mirror. I knew what he wanted. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not going in there." But the mirror man didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, his smile never wavering. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. And then, suddenly, the room went silent. When I looked back at the mirror man was gone. But so was my reflection. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass, and that's when I saw it. A glimpse of Liam, standing in a dark, endless void, his face pale and frightened. "Ella, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Help me." I didn't think. I just acted. I reached out and touched the mirror, my fingers pressing against the cold glass. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the surface rippled, like water, pulling me in. The next thing I knew, I was standing in darkness. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the only light came from the faint glow of the mirrors scattered around me. Each mirror showed a different scene: my house, my parents, and finally, Liam. He was trapped in a mirror, his hands pressed against the glass as he screamed silently. I ran to him, but before I could reach the mirror man stepped into view. He moved with impossible speed, his limbs twisting unnaturally as he blocked my path. "You don't belong here," he hissed, his voice echoing all around me. "I'm not leaving without my brother," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. The mirror man tilted his head, considering me. Then he smiled, his teeth sharp and gleaming. "Trade," he said simply. I understood what he meant. One soul for another. I hesitated, my mind racing. But when I looked at Liam, his face pale and terrified, I knew there was no other choice. "Take me," I whispered. "Let him go." The mirror man's smile widened, and before I could change my mind, he reached out and touched my forehead. The last thing I saw was Liam's mirror shattering, his figure disappearing into the light. And then everything went dark. I woke up in my room, the morning sun streaming through the window. Liam was sitting on the edge of my bed, his face streaked with tears. "You're back," he whispered, pulling me into a tight hug. But when I glanced at the mirror across the room, I saw the truth. My reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was the mirror man, staring back at me with a grin that would haunt me forever. I grew up hearing about the crying lady of Hollow Creek. It was one of those stories everyone in town knew, passed down like a family heirloom. Every Halloween, older kids dared each other to visit the creek after dark. They'd come back with wild tales of ghostly whispers or distant sobbing, but nothing concrete. The legend was simple. A woman named Eleanor lost her child in the creek long ago. Desperate and heartbroken, she spent days searching the waters before drowning herself in grief. Or so the story went. They say she never left, that she still roams the area, searching and crying for her lost child. I always thought it was just a spooky tale to keep kids from playing near the water. But last summer, I found out how real it was. It started innocently enough. My friends, Kayla and Jared, were visiting for the weekend. They loved ghost stories, and of course, someone brought up the crying lady. "I heard she pulls you into the creek if you get too close," Jared said, grinning. Kayla rolled her eyes. "That's just to scare kids. There's no way it's real." I tried to brush it off, but something about the way Jared looked at me told me he had a plan. Sure enough, later that night, he suggested we check it out. "You're kidding," I said, crossing my arms. "It's pitch black out there." "That's the point," Jared replied, his flashlight already in hand. Kayla hesitated, but eventually shrugged. "Why not? It'll be fun." Reluctantly, I grabbed my own flashlight, silently cursing myself for going along with it. We set out just before midnight, following the narrow dirt path that led to Hollow Creek. The air was thick and humid, the kind of oppressive heat that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The creek wasn't far, but the walk felt longer in the dark. The trees pressed in around us, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, though Jared seemed unfazed. When we finally reached the water, the creek was eerily calm. The surface reflected the moonlight like a sheet of glass, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. "See," Jared said, sweeping his flashlight across the water. "Nothing to be scared of," but then we heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic sound that didn't belong. "Do you hear that?" Kayla whispered, her eyes wide. We fell silent, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was crying. A chill ran down my spine. It was a woman's voice, low and mournful, echoing through the trees. "Okay, very funny," I said, turning to Jared. "You planned this, didn't you?" But the look on his face told me he hadn't. This isn't me," he stammered, his bravado melting away. The crying grew closer, more desperate, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me, like it was seeping into my very soul. "We should leave," Kayla said, backing away. But before we could move, the sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening, and then the water rippled. At first, it was just a small disturbance, like a fish breaking the surface. But the ripples grew larger, spreading out across the creek. And then we saw her. She rose slowly from the water, her figure pale and shrouded in what looked like a tattered white dress. Her hair clung to her face in dark, wet strands, and her eyes, sunken and hollow, seemed to pierce through us. "Have you seen my child?" she whispered, her voice cracked and filled with sorrow. None of us answered. We were too stunned, too terrified to move. "Have you seen my child?" she asked again, louder this time, her tone shifting from despair to anger. Jared broke first, grabbing Kayla's arm and pulling her toward the path. "Run!" he shouted. We took off, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted through the trees. But no matter how far we ran, we couldn't escape the sound of her voice. "Where is my child?" she wailed, her cries echoing all around us. I don't know how we made it back to the house, but when we slammed the door shut, it felt like we crossed some invisible barrier. The air inside was still, the crying finally gone. For a moment, none of us spoke. Jared was pale, his hands trembling, and Kayla sat on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. We saw her," I finally said, breaking the silence. "She's real." The next day, we couldn't stop talking about it. Jared was convinced she was some kind of ghost, while Kayla thought it was tied to the old legend. "I think she's trapped," Kayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She can't move on until she finds her child." "What if the child isn't in the creek?" Jared asked. "What if it's somewhere else?" The thought sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow eyes, that desperate expression. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside my window. It was faint, but unmistakable. Crying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I got up and peeked through the curtains. There, standing in the yard, was the crying lady. Her head was tilted up, her sunken eyes locked onto my window. "Have you seen my child?" she whispered, her voice carrying through the still night air. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair. When I looked again, she was gone. The next morning, I told Kayla and Jared what had happened. "She followed us," I said, my voice shaking. "She's not just at the creek anymore." Kayla looked troubled. "Maybe we need to do something to help her." "Help her?" Jared snapped. "She's a ghost. What are we supposed to do?" Despite Jared's protests, we decided to return to the creek that evening. Kayla thought we should try talking to her, maybe even help her find closure. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but something about the crying lady's sorrow had stuck with me. It wasn't just terrifying, it was heartbreaking. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air heavy with tension. "Eleanor?" Kayla called out, stepping cautiously toward the water. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the crying started again, soft and distant. "Eleanor, we want to help you," Kayla said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The crying grew louder, and once again, she appeared. Her figure rose from the water, her expression filled with despair. "Have you seen my child?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kayla stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the woman's gaunt features. "We don't know where your child is," she said gently, "but maybe we can help you find peace." Eleanor's hollow eyes fixed on Kayla, and for a moment, it looked like she might cry again. But then her face twisted into something dark, something angry. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the trees. "You took my child." The water around her churned violently, and the air grew icy cold. Jared grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here." But Kayla stood her ground. Eleanor, please. We're not your enemies." The crying lady let out a guttural scream, her form twisting and contorting as the water swirled around her. And then, just as suddenly as it started, she stopped. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Find them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Bring them back." Before we could respond, she vanished, leaving the creek still and silent once more. We left in a daze, unsure of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. The crying lady wasn't at rest. And until her child was found, she never would be. We never solved the mystery of the crying lady, but to this day, I can still hear her voice sometimes, echoing in the night. "Have you seen my child?" They call it Dead Man's Turn, a stretch of highway just outside of town where strange things are said to happen. Over the years, there have been countless accidents, mysterious disappearances, and eerie sightings. Some say it's cursed. Others blame an old urban legend about a hitchhiker who was killed there decades ago and now haunts the road, looking for a ride home. I never believed the stories. They seemed like typical small-town gossip, exaggerated over time. But that was before the night I drove down that road, before I saw her. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was driving back from a party at my friend Jamie's house. I wasn't drunk, just tired and eager to get home. The sky was moonless, the kind of dark that makes the world feel smaller, like it's closing in on you. Dead Man's Turn was the quickest route back to my neighborhood, but I hesitated before turning onto the highway. The stories were on my mind, even though I kept telling myself they were nonsense. Still, I couldn't shake the unease as I rounded the first curve. The road was eerily quiet, with only the hum of my car engine breaking the silence. Trees lined either side, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows under my headlights. About halfway down the stretch, I saw something that made my stomach flip. A figure stood by the side of the road, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, wearing a long, pale dress that seemed almost to glow. Her hair was dark, hanging in damp strands around her face, and she was holding one arm out, thumb extended, like she was hitchhiking. My first thought was that she must have been in trouble. Maybe her car broke down, or she'd been left stranded. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Hey," I called out, my voice uncertain. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She didn't respond right away. She just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Finally, she nodded and walked toward the car. Up close, she looked even stranger. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her eyes were dark, almost hollow. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her movements slow and deliberate. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She turned to look at me, her gaze intense. "Home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where's home?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed straight ahead, down the road. The air inside the car felt colder, and I tried to ignore the way her presence made my skin crawl. I kept driving, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "Have you ever heard the story?" she asked, her voice low and distant. "What story?" I replied, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "The one about this road," she said, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "They say a woman was killed here, years ago. She was trying to hitch a ride, but the driver didn't stop in time." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I've heard it," I said cautiously. "They say she still waits," the woman continued, her tone eerily calm, "hoping someone will take her home." I glanced at her, my heart pounding. "Is that why you're out here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of her lips that made my stomach twist. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the void. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard and frowned. It felt like I'd been driving for hours, but the time hadn't changed. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Almost there," she replied, her gaze still locked on the road. The further we drove, the stranger things became. The trees outside seemed to blur together, their branches forming unnatural shapes. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest. And then, out of nowhere, she started humming. It was a soft, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to focus on the road, but the sound seemed to fill the car, wrapping around me like a cold hand. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Look, I think this is as far as I can take you," I said, pulling the car to a stop. She turned to me, her dark eyes boring into mine. "We're not there yet," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm sorry," I stammered, reaching for the door handle. "I need to go." Before I could finish, the engine died. Panic set in as I twisted the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The lights flickered, and in the dim glow, I saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. She wasn't sitting in the passenger seat anymore. She was in the back, her face inches from mine. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. I scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I turned to face her. Her smile was gone, replaced by an expression of pure malice. "Why are you in such a hurry?" she hissed. "You said you'd take me home." The air in the car grew colder, frost creeping across the windows. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone, but the screen was dead, just like everything else. She leaned closer, her face inches from mine. "You can't leave," she whispered. "Not yet." In a desperate move, I slammed my hand against the horn. The sudden blare broke the suffocating silence, and for a moment, the frost receded. I twisted the key again, and this time, the engine roared to life. Without looking back, I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped down the road. The car rattled violently as I tore through the darkness, the trees whipping past in a blur. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her still sitting there, but the back seat was empty. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the stories had gotten to my head. But then I heard her voice. It came from the radio, crackling through the static. "You can't escape," she said, her tone cold and final. The car jerked violently, as if something had slammed into it. I struggled to keep control, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The headlights flickered, and in their brief glow, I saw her standing in the middle of the road. I swerved to avoid her, the tires skidding on the asphalt. The car spun out, crashing into the ditch. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. The car was still, the windshield cracked, and the air was filled with the smell of burnt rubber. I stumbled out, my legs shaky, and looked around. The road was empty, the trees silent. But then I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the faint light. She was facing away from me, her pale dress billowing in an unseen wind. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I don't know how I made it back to town. The next thing I remember, I was pounding on Jamie's door, my heart racing and my body trembling. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come out. The only thing I could say was, "She's real." The next day, I went back to the road with my dad to tow the car. When we found it, my blood ran cold. Scratched into the frost-covered windshield, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word: soon. I haven't driven down Dead Man's Turn since that night, but sometimes, when the house is quiet, I still hear her humming, and I know she's waiting for me to finish what I started. When I was little, my grandpa used to tell us stories about the woods near his house. He'd sit in his creaky old rocking chair, his pipe sending swirls of smoke into the air, and spin tales about the Watcher. The Watcher, according to him, was an ancient spirit tied to the forest. He wasn't evil, exactly, but he wasn't friendly either. He would watch anyone who entered the woods, judging them silently. If he found you worthy, you'd leave the woods unscathed. If he didn't, well, Grandpa would trail off with a grim look, as if the rest was too terrible to say. I always thought it was just one of those scary stories grown-ups tell to keep kids from wandering too far. But as I got older, I started hearing whispers in town. Strange disappearances, unexplainable sightings. And last summer, I found out for myself that the Watcher is no myth. It all started when my friend Chris dared me to camp in the woods. "You're always saying the stories aren't real," he said, grinning. "Prove it." I didn't want to back down, especially not in front of my other friends, so I agreed. I mean, what was the worst that could happen? We planned it out, Me, Chris, and two other friends, Jamie and Liz. We packed tents, flashlights, and enough snacks to last us the night. Chris even brought his dad's old hunting knife, just in case. The hike into the woods was uneventful at first. The sun filtered through the dense canopy, and the air was filled with the smell of pine and earth. We joked and laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to camp, the sun was beginning to set. The shadows grew longer, and the trees seemed to press in closer. "Let's get the fire going before it gets dark," Jamie said, breaking the uneasy silence. We set up the tents and gathered wood for the fire. As the flames crackled and cast dancing light on the trees, the woods around us seemed to come alive with unfamiliar sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and faint whispers that could have been the wind. Chris, ever the jokester, decided it was the perfect time to bring up Grandpa's stories. "So," he said, his voice low and dramatic, "who's ready to meet the Watcher?" Liz rolled her eyes, but Jamie looked uneasy. "Maybe we shouldn't joke about that," she said quietly. "Come on, it's just a story," Chris said, tossing another log onto the fire. As the night wore on, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and owls were gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. "Do you guys feel that?" Liz asked, hugging her knees to her chest. "Feel what?" Chris replied, though even he sounded less confident now. Like we're not alone," she whispered. At first, we dismissed it as paranoia, but then the noises started. It was faint at first, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, just beyond the light of the fire. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled us, slow and deliberate, never coming into view. "Okay, that's not funny," Jamie said, glaring at Chris. "It's not me," he said, his face pale. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but the beams seemed swallowed by the darkness. That's when Liz screamed. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, her hand shaking. "There. Did you see it?" We all turned, but there was nothing there. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice trembling. "A face," she whispered. "It was watching us." We huddled closer to the fire, trying to convince ourselves that Liz had just imagined it. But deep down, I knew she hadn't. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light revealing shapes that shouldn't be there. Then we heard the voice. It was low and guttural, coming from all around us. "Why are you here?" Jamie clutched my arm. "Did you hear that?" We all nodded, too terrified to speak. "Let's just leave," Liz whispered. "We shouldn't be here." Chris shook his head. "We can't leave now. It's too dark. We'll get lost." "We'll get lost if we stay," she snapped. Before we could decide what to do, the voice came again, louder this time. "Why are you here?" The fire suddenly flared, the flames shooting higher than they should have. Shadows danced wildly on the trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw something standing just beyond the light. A tall, humanoid figure with glowing eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us answered. Suddenly, the footsteps started again, this time louder and faster, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "Okay, we're leaving," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "Now." We doused the fire and packed up as quickly as we could, our hands fumbling in our haste. But as we stepped into the trees, the forest seemed different, darker, denser, and more labyrinthine. No matter which way we turned, the path seemed to loop back on itself. The trees looked identical, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing us down. "This isn't right," Jamie said, her voice trembling. "We're going in circles. Just keep moving," Chris said, though his usual bravado was gone. That's when we saw it. Standing in the middle of the path was the figure. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, with limbs that seemed too long for a human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its head tilted to the side as if studying us. "Run," Liz whispered, her voice breaking. We turned and sprinted, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we tore through the underbrush. But no matter how fast we ran, the figure was always there, just ahead or just behind, appearing and disappearing like a nightmare we couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us, overlapping into a cacophony of unintelligible words. And then the forest opened up. We stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, faint but persistent. What does it want?" Jamie asked, clutching her chest. Chris shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't have come here." "No kidding," Liz snapped, tears streaming down her face. As we stood there, trying to catch our breath, the ground beneath us began to shift. It felt soft and unstable, like we were standing on sand instead of dirt. The whispers grew louder, forming words now. "Leave," they said. "You do not belong." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran again, not caring which direction we went as long as it was away from the clearing. After what felt like hours, we finally broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road. The woods were silent now, but the oppressive feeling lingered, like we were still being watched. When we got back to town, we didn't talk about what had happened. Not at first, but as the days passed, we started to notice strange things. Scratches on our windows, footprints in the dirt outside our houses, and, sometimes, the faint sound of whispers when we were alone. I don't know what the Watcher is or what it wants, but one thing is certain: it's real. And once you've seen it, it never stops watching. As a kid, I used to hear strange stories. The ones that sounded too scary to be true, but were told by people who swore on their lives that they had experienced them firsthand. Most of the time, I shrugged them off. But one particular story I heard from an old friend of my mother's haunted me for years. It was about a man with no face. The legend was simple yet terrifying. They said that the faceless man wandered the streets at night, walking between shadows, never seen clearly by anyone. His face was missing, smooth and blank like a featureless mask. He was always just a little too close to people, lurking in the corners of their vision, and some claimed to have seen him standing outside their windows, silently watching them. I never believed it, of course. I thought it was just another creepy story designed to scare children. But one summer night, everything changed. It was the summer after I graduated high school. I had just finished my exams and was planning to take a break before heading off to college. One night, I decided to go for a walk, something I often did when I needed to clear my head. The streets were quiet, the kind of calm that only comes when the world seems to be asleep. I lived in a small town with narrow streets lined with old houses. There was a park at the edge of town that I liked to visit, and as I walked, I found myself heading in that direction. The air was cool, the night sky clear, and the moon hung high, casting long shadows across the pavement. As I walked, I passed a few familiar houses, their windows dark, and the sound of crickets filled the air. It was peaceful, but there was something about the night that felt different, almost wrong. I shook the feeling off, thinking it was just my imagination. But then I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another person out for a late-night walk. He was standing by a lamppost near the park entrance, his back to me, his body outlined against the dim light. I couldn't see his face from where I was, but I didn't think much of it. After all, this was a quiet town, and it wasn't uncommon to see someone out at this hour. But as I drew closer, I started to feel an odd sense of unease. Something about the way he stood, perfectly still, felt off. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I hesitated, then decided to pass by. It wasn't like me to be scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get away from him. As I walked past, my heart started racing, and I glanced over at him. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw his head turn toward me, though I couldn't be sure. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing dread that was settling in my chest. But as I continued on, I felt an overwhelming urge to look back. When I did, my blood ran cold. The man was no longer standing by the lamppost. In fact, he wasn't anywhere to be seen. But there, just beyond the reach of the streetlight, standing in the shadows, I saw him again. His back was to me, but this time, I could feel his presence in a way that made my stomach churn. Something was wrong. He was too still, too quiet, and the shadows seemed to cling to him like he was part of them. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, and my legs began to move faster, almost on their own accord. I reached the park entrance, and I turned to look once more. The man was gone. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I wasn't a little kid anymore. I knew better than to get scared by shadows and strange figures. But as I sat on a bench in the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to enjoy the quiet, but my mind kept racing. Every little noise, every rustling of leaves, made me jump. I looked over my shoulder several times, half expecting to see the man standing just beyond the trees. But each time, the park was empty. After a while, I decided to leave. I stood up, ready to head back home, but as I turned to walk down the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was standing in front of me, but this time, he wasn't just standing still. He was walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. He was dressed in a dark suit, and his gait was smooth, almost too smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking. His hands were at his sides, and his face was smooth, blank, empty. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a perfectly smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. He took another step forward, and then another. My body finally reacted. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The park was small, but the distance between me and the exit felt like miles. The sound of my own breathing drowned out everything else. I wasn't even sure if he was following me, if he was still there at all, but I couldn't risk looking back. I just kept running, my feet pounding against the pavement, the night air cold in my lungs. When I finally reached my street, I stopped to catch my breath. My hands shook, and I felt like I was going to collapse. I looked around, but the street was still and empty. There was no sign of the man. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I took a long, roundabout way, checking over my shoulder at every turn. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the image of the man's empty face. It felt like he was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't sleep much, and when I did, I dreamed of the man. His face, or lack of it, haunted me, a constant presence in my thoughts. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I was too scared they'd think I was crazy, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. I began to notice things around town that I hadn't before. People talking in hushed voices about strange sightings, whispers about a man with no face who had been seen walking through the streets at night. It was like I wasn't the only one who had encountered him. One evening, a week after my encounter, I decided to take a walk again. I don't know why I did it. I guess part of me thought that if I faced my fear, it would go away. But as I walked toward the park again, I felt the air grow heavy, like something was about to happen. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the park, just like the first time. Only this time, he wasn't still. He was moving, walking toward me with that same smooth, gliding gait. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew I had to leave. But as I turned to run, something inside me snapped. I had to know. I had to know what was behind that empty face. I turned back around and walked straight toward him. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. But I could feel his gaze, even if I couldn't see his eyes. It was like he was inside my head, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. As I got closer, I reached out a trembling hand and touched his arm. The instant my fingers made contact, a shock ran through me, cold and sharp. It felt like I was touching ice, but there was no chill in the air. My body froze, and the world around me seemed to blur. My vision swam, and I heard a voice, a deep, hollow voice, whisper in my ear, "You're not supposed to see me." Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying in the grass at the edge of the park, my head pounding. The faceless man was gone, but I knew something had changed. The townspeople still talk about him, but now, it's different. Now, I can see him too. and every time I close my eyes, I can feel his gaze. I had always been a bit of a skeptic. Growing up, I would hear all sorts of bizarre stories from my friends and family. Tales about haunted houses, creepy creatures, and ghosts that would whisper your name in the dark. But I always thought they were just that, stories. Urban legends passed down to give you goosebumps, to make you think twice when walking home late at night. I never imagined that one of those stories would turn out to be true, especially one that had been haunting my small town for decades. It all started when I was 16. I was hanging out at my best friend Mia's house, as we often did on Friday nights. We were sprawled on the couch, binge-watching old horror movies and joking around, when Mia brought up something strange. "Have you heard of the Midnight Caller?" she asked, her eyes wide as she glanced over at me. I raised an eyebrow. "The Midnight Caller? That sounds like a bad horror flick." Mia shook her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. "No, it's a real thing. At least, that's what people say." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, so it's another one of those spooky stories?" "Kind of," she said, leaning in closer. "But it's different. People around here say that if you answer the phone at midnight, you'll hear a voice on the other end. It doesn't say anything, but it's so wrong. Like, it's not human. And if you pick up, you're marked." "Marked? What does that even mean?" Mia's face turned serious. "People say it's like a curse. Once the midnight caller gets you, you start seeing things. Strange things. You hear voices, and sometimes people disappear. No one knows who or what it is, but the legends say you can never escape once you're marked." I laughed it off, of course. "You watch way too many scary movies. There's no way that's real." Mia looked at me for a long moment, and then she smiled. "You'll see. Don't say I didn't warn you." That night, as I was heading home, the thought of the midnight caller kept popping into my head. I brushed it off. It was just a silly local legend, nothing more. But that didn't stop the unease that crept over me as I walked home alone in the dark. The next few weeks passed without incident, and I forgot about Mia's story. But then, one night, as I was settling into bed, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. The sound of my phone ringing. It was a little after midnight. I stared at my phone in disbelief. I wasn't expecting any calls, and certainly not this late at night. My thumb hovered over the screen, hesitation flooding me. It could be a wrong number or a prank call. But the weirdest part was that the call was from an unknown number. No name, no ID, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. I remembered Mia's words from that night. The midnight caller. My fingers trembled as I pressed answer. There was nothing. No greeting, no sound, just silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a faint noise crackled through the phone. It was a low hum, like static, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the usual noise you get from a bad connection. This was deliberate. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the hum stopped. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart racing in my chest. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. Just a weird coincidence, I told myself. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The following days were normal, or at least, they seemed that way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about that call, the unsettling hum on the other end. I noticed things, strange things. I started hearing faint whispers in the silence of my room, voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. And it wasn't just in my room. I heard them when I was walking down the street, when I was sitting in class. It was like they were following me, getting closer with every passing day. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, one night, it happened again. I was sitting in my living room, the house quiet as I watched TV. It was nearly midnight, and I felt a strange sense of dread crawling up my spine. My phone, sitting on the coffee table, buzzed. The time read 12:01 a.m. I froze. I couldn't help it. There, on the screen, was the same unknown number. The same call I had gotten weeks ago. For a moment, I just stared at it. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to hear that hum again. But then, against my better judgment, I grabbed the phone. It could be someone just messing with me, right? I swiped to answer, but the second I did, my hand froze. The same low static sound filled my ears, this time louder, almost like it was building to something. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my palms sweating. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. And then, a voice spoke. "Come closer." It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was there, and it was coming from the phone. My breath caught in my throat. Who is this?" I stammered, but there was no response. Only more static, more low hums that seemed to reverberate through my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, echoing on the other end. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. I could still hear the footsteps, even though the call had ended. And I realized then, there was someone in my house. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every whisper, every sound from the outside world seemed to be amplified, each one making my heart race faster. I spent the night watching the shadows move, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But by morning, nothing had changed. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. The midnight caller wasn't just a story. It was real, and I had been marked. In the days that followed, I began to notice things more clearly. People would stare at me strangely as I walked by, their gazes lingering just a little too long. I heard their whispers, the way they muttered about me when they thought I wasn't listening. "She's next," they would say. She answered the call. It was like the midnight caller had claimed me, and now the town knew. It felt as though everyone was in on some terrible secret, watching me, waiting for the inevitable. And I couldn't escape. I stopped answering the phone altogether, but it didn't matter. The whispers continued, growing louder, more persistent. And that night, something even worse happened. I was walking home from a friend's house, the streets empty and dark. My mind was consumed with fear, my heart pounding as I felt the presence of someone following me. The footsteps echoed behind me, just like before. I quickened my pace, but so did they. I turned the corner, and the air felt colder, thicker. And then, I saw him. A figure standing at the end of the street, cloaked in shadow. He was tall, too tall. His outline was indistinct, but I could feel his eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. He didn't move. He didn't have to. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if something was holding me back. I turned down another street, desperate to escape, but the footsteps never stopped. They followed me, and then I heard it. The voice. The same voice that had spoken to me over the phone. "Come closer." I don't remember much after that. My mind went blank, the fear overwhelming me, and when I woke up, I was back in my house. The phone was on the floor beside me. The screen cracked and shattered, but the whispers were gone. The footsteps had stopped. It was as if I had imagined it all, but I knew I hadn't. The midnight caller wasn't just a story. It was a curse, and now it had me, and it would never let me go. There's a legend in my town that no one likes to talk about. It's the kind of thing whispered in corners, spoken only in hushed tones at the dinner table or in the quiet hours before bed. But for me, it wasn't just a story. It became a terrifying reality. It all started when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. It wasn't a grand place, just a two-story home with a few rooms and a lot of charm. But it had a history, one that the locals loved to gossip about. The house had been empty for years, with rumors swirling around it. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it had a curse on it. But the one thing that stood out to me was the legend of the Mirror Man. The Mirror Man wasn't a ghost, at least not in the traditional sense. He didn't haunt you in your sleep or rattle chains in the attic. Instead, he was something much worse, something far more real. The story went like this. A long time ago, a family lived in the house I now called home. They were a normal family at first, but everything changed when they brought in an antique mirror. It was an elaborate, full-length mirror, the kind you'd find in an old estate, with a carved frame that seemed to gleam even in the darkest rooms. It had been passed down through generations, and it was said to have a strange power. No one knew exactly what it was, but the mirror began to change the family. They started to act differently, more paranoid, more irritable. Then, One by one, they began disappearing. No one knew how or why. The only clue left behind was the mirror, always standing tall, untouched, its surface reflecting nothing but the darkness around it. Over time, the family's disappearance became part of the local folklore. The mirror was said to trap people inside its reflection, taking their very souls. The curse, it seemed, wasn't just in the house. It was in the mirror itself. And ever since, the people of the town swore to never go near that house again. When I first walked into the house, I didn't know any of this. It was just a place I could afford while I was finishing my senior year of high school. My parents were busy, and I wanted to experience living alone before heading off to college. The house wasn't perfect, but it had character. The walls were old and creaky, the floors a little worn down, but there was something about it that felt comforting. I moved in during the fall, just before the weather turned cold. The first few days were peaceful. I unpacked my things, set up my room, and spent time exploring the house. The living room had a large fireplace, the kind you could imagine lighting a fire in on a chilly evening. The kitchen was small but functional. Upstairs, my room was cozy with a large window that let in a lot of light. But it was the bathroom that caught my attention. There, leaning against the wall, was a full-length mirror. It was beautiful, just like the one in the legend. The frame was dark wood, intricately carved with floral patterns, and the glass, despite its age, still gleamed. There was something unsettling about it, though. It felt like it was watching me. I decided to leave it there for now. It wasn't like I had a choice. The mirror was too big to move easily, and besides, it seemed to fit with the old-fashioned charm of the house. But from the moment I stood in front of it, I started to feel uneasy. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection when I knew no one was there. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't truly alone. The first night I stayed in the house, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise seemed amplified. The creaking of the floorboards, the sound of the wind howling outside. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, behind me. But when I looked directly at it, nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself it was just nerves. It was a new place, after all. I was just adjusting. But the next night, something happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. There was an overwhelming feeling of dread in the air, something thick and suffocating. My room was dark, save for the faint light coming from the bathroom door. I heard a noise, soft, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the mirror. I turned my head slowly, my heart racing. The mirror was reflecting the room, just as it should, but there was something different about it. The reflection seemed to be distorted, as though the room in the mirror wasn't exactly the same as the one in front of me. The edges were blurry, the colors darker. And then, I saw it. A figure stood in the reflection. It wasn't me. It was tall, shadowy, and its features were indistinct. The face was blank. No eyes, no mouth. Just a dark void where a person's features should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head quickly to look at the real room behind me. There was no one there. I shot up from the bed, my heart pounding, and rushed to the bathroom to get a better look at the mirror. It was perfectly normal, the reflection clear and unmoving. I shook my head, telling myself I was just imagining things. Maybe I had been dreaming. But the unease lingered, gnawing at me as I tried to fall back asleep. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The mirror felt like it was watching me, always there, always present. At times, I would walk past it and catch a glimpse of movement in the glass. But when I turned around, there was nothing behind me. I decided to talk to Mia about it. She was the one who had warned me about the house in the first place, and I needed someone to reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. When I told her about the mirror, her face turned pale. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "Seen what?" I replied, confused. "The Mirror Man," she whispered, as though saying the name out loud would make him appear. "It's not just a story. People say that once you start seeing things in the mirror, it means you've been marked. And once you're marked, there's no escape." I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean? What happens next? Mia's voice dropped to a low murmur. "It's different for everyone. Some people see shadows moving in the mirror. Others hear voices. But eventually, the mirror man starts to take you. One way or another, he claims you. And no one who's been marked by him has ever gotten away. I didn't want to believe her, but as the days passed, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. It wasn't just in my head. The whispers came more frequently. The figure in the mirror appeared more often, and I noticed the edges of the reflection becoming more distorted, more unreal. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was really happening. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. The longer I looked, the more I felt like I was sinking into it, as though the mirror wasn't just a surface, it was a doorway. And then, something terrifying happened. The figure appeared again. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It stepped forward, its dark, featureless face staring back at me, as if it could see right through me. The air grew colder, and I felt the unmistakable pull of the mirror, as if it were reaching for me, trying to drag me into its depths. I screamed and stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The mirror seemed to hum with energy, vibrating slightly as if it was alive. I scrambled to my feet and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror tilted its head slightly, as if watching me. And then, to my horror, it moved its hand toward the glass. Slowly, its hand reached out, its fingers pressing against the surface of the mirror. I felt the temperature drop, the air growing thick and suffocating. And then, the reflection grinned. I don't remember how I managed to get out of the house that night. All I know is that I ran. I ran as fast as I could, away from the house, away from the mirror. I didn't stop until I reached Mia's house, shaking and terrified. It's been a week since that night, and I haven't been back to the house. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see the figure in the mirror, its empty face grinning at me. I'm marked now, and I know there's no escaping the mirror man. The house still stands on Elm Street, and the mirror is still inside, waiting. I've heard whispers that the next person to move in will be the next victim. And I know, deep down, that whoever it is won't be able to outrun the curse. Because once you've seen the mirror man, there's no turning back. It was the night my life changed forever. The night when a long-forgotten urban legend turned all too real. It began innocently enough. I was on a road trip with my cousin Sarah. We'd been driving for hours, just trying to escape the monotony of our everyday lives. We needed an adventure, and we'd found the perfect destination. A small, sleepy town tucked away in the mountains called Widow's Peak. The town was known for its eerie atmosphere, its old homes, and an infamous legend that had been passed down for generations. The legend of the Lantern of Widow's Peak. The story goes that years ago, a young woman named Eleanor had lived in a small cottage on the edge of town. She was the widow of a soldier who had gone off to war and never returned. Devastated by the loss, Eleanor would stand by the window every night, staring out at the darkened hills, waiting for the light of her husband's return. Every night, she would light a lantern and place it in the window, hoping that the light would guide him home. But he never came back. Instead, the townspeople say that the lantern's light grew stronger and brighter with each passing night, until one fateful evening, Eleanor was seen walking toward the cliffs above Widow's Peak, the lantern still burning bright in her hands. It was the last anyone saw of her. The next morning, they found the lantern on the cliffside, but Eleanor was gone, vanished without a trace. The town quickly fell silent, and the legend of the Lantern of Widow's Peak was born. Some say that on certain nights, you can still see the lantern burning at the top of the peak, and that whoever sees the light is cursed to follow it, to wander the hills forever, searching for the lost widow. It was a story that everyone in the town knew, but it was just that, a story. At least, that's what I thought when I first heard it. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts. I figured it was just a spooky tale meant to keep the kids out of the mountains after dark. When Sarah and I arrived in Widow's Peak, we were greeted by the usual small-town charm. The streets were quiet, lined with old brick buildings and cozy cottages. We stayed at a bed and breakfast that looked like it had been built a century ago. The old woman who ran the place welcomed us with a smile, her eyes twinkling as she handed us a key. "You two are just in time," she said, her voice raspy. "The full moon's tonight. Perfect night for a hike up Widow's Peak if you're looking for an adventure." Sarah and I exchanged a glance. The legend of the lantern came to mind, and we both laughed it off. It was just a story. After all, what harm could it do to explore the mountain at night? That night, after a dinner of homemade stew and some local gossip, we decided to head out. We had flashlights and our phones in case we needed them, but other than that, we were just two curious girls in the quiet, dark wilderness. As we hiked up the mountain, the woods grew denser and the air became colder. The full moon lit our path, casting long shadows through the trees. "The lantern of Widow's Peak," Sarah said, her voice playful as she turned to me. "Do you think we'll see it?" I chuckled. "Of course not. It's just a legend." But as we neared the summit, something changed. The wind picked up, and the night seemed to grow quieter. The trees, once swaying gently in the breeze, were now still. The world felt different. There was an odd tension in the air, as if something was watching us. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. "Hear what?" Sarah pointed toward the top of the peak, where the trees parted and the land flattened out. "Look," she said, her voice trembling. And there it was. At the top of the mountain, glowing faintly in the distance, was a light. A soft, flickering glow, like the light of a lantern. It wasn't like any light we'd seen before. It wasn't a flash from a car or the glow of a distant town. It was an eerie, golden hue, hovering just above the ground. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving toward it, her feet crunching on the dry leaves as she pushed forward. I hesitated for a moment, my legs frozen in place. But then, something inside me urged me to follow her. A mix of curiosity and dread pulled me forward, step by step, closer to the light. As we got closer, the lantern grew brighter, its golden light casting long shadows on the ground. It wasn't just a simple lantern. It was like a beacon, glowing in the darkness. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. It could be someone with a flashlight, maybe even another hiker. But something didn't feel right. When we reached the clearing, we stopped in our tracks. The lantern was standing alone in the middle of the clearing, its light flickering as if it had been left unattended for years. But there was no one around. The woods were silent again. It was as though the world had gone still. I stepped closer, and the air seemed to grow colder. The lantern's glow was now almost blinding, and I could feel a weight pressing down on me, like the atmosphere itself was thick with an ancient energy. My breath came in short gasps as I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed the lantern's cold metal frame, I heard something. A soft, faint whisper carried by the wind. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, sweet and sorrowful. "Please find me." I froze. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin prickled with a sudden sense of dread, and I looked around frantically, but there was no one. The woods were empty. Only the lantern remained, glowing brighter than ever. Sarah's face went pale. She reached for my arm. "We should go. Now." But it was too late. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was reacting to the lantern's presence. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, stronger this time, and the light from the lantern flickered violently. The trees around us swayed, bending as though in the grip of some unseen force. The shadows grew deeper, more menacing. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. The voice had become louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, crying out in agony. "Please find me." And then, I saw it. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a woman, standing at the edge of the clearing, her white dress billowing in the wind. Her face was obscured, but there was something haunting about her presence. She stood motionless, staring at the lantern. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my heart racing in terror as the figure stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Eleanor," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's her, the widow." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The woman took another step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath our feet. She was getting closer, her presence overwhelming, her sadness suffocating. The voice, still whispering, echoed in my mind. "Please find me." I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. My body felt numb. And then, as if the world had exhaled, the woman disappeared, her figure fading into the night like mist. The lantern's glow flickered once more, and then, just like that, it went out. The woods returned to their eerie silence. The breeze calmed. The darkness felt normal again. But nothing was normal. We stood there in shock, our hearts pounding in our chests. It was only then that I realized we were no longer alone on the mountain. We were marked, just like the legend said. We had seen the lantern of Widow's Peak, and now it would follow us. The curse was real. Eleanor's voice, her pain, would haunt us forever. The whisper followed us as we turned to leave, a chilling reminder that some stories are more than just tales. And no matter how far we ran, we would always hear her voice, calling out from the shadows, "Please find me." Every town has its secrets. The ones people don't talk about, the ones that only come up when you're with the wrong people or in the wrong place. When I moved to Glen Hollow, a small town nestled between the woods and a river, I had no idea how strange things were. I thought it would be just like any other town, quiet, peaceful, and maybe a little boring. But I soon found out that Glen Hollow had a story, a chilling urban legend that seemed to haunt the very streets I walked. The legend was about a figure known simply as the Smiling Man. The first time I heard the story, it was from my friend Lucy. She was a local and had grown up in Glen Hollow, so when I started school there, she was one of the first people I met. She was friendly, but there was a nervousness about her whenever we talked about the town's history. "You'll hear about the Smiling Man eventually," Lucy said one day as we walked home from school. "People talk about him, but no one really likes to. He's more than just a story. He's real." I laughed, brushing it off as a typical creepy town tale. The Smiling Man? It sounded like the kind of thing that would make for a good ghost story around a campfire, but nothing more. But Lucy's face was serious, and she looked around as if checking for someone nearby. "You're new here. I don't want you to end up in trouble. Don't ever walk alone at night. And never, ever go near the old street by the cemetery. That's where he appears." "Who?" I asked, my curiosity growing despite myself. Lucy hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The Smiling Man. He's a tall guy, always dressed in a suit. But the thing is, his face is always smiling, no matter what. People say he's harmless at first, but if you see him, you won't be able to forget him. And if you see him enough times, well, people don't come back." I rolled my eyes, trying to hide my unease. "That's just a story, right?" Lucy didn't respond right away. She just stared ahead, her footsteps quickening. "I used to think that too, but I saw him once, and I haven't been the same since." I didn't know what to say to that. I was still skeptical, but the way Lucy spoke, the fear in her eyes, made me start to wonder if there was more to the story than I'd first thought. A few days later, I found myself walking home from school late. It was getting dark, and I had taken a different route than usual, passing the cemetery Lucy had warned me about. I'd forgotten all about the Smiling Man story until I looked up and saw an old street sign, Smiling Avenue. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. It wasn't even that late, just past dusk, but the streets were oddly empty. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of cars. As I passed the cemetery, I couldn't help but glance over at the wrought iron gate. That's when I saw him, a figure standing just inside the gate. He was tall, impossibly so, and wore an old-fashioned suit that looked out of place for someone standing in the middle of the street at night. But it was his face that stopped me in my tracks. His smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something that made my stomach twist. I froze, my heart racing. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't look away. His eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something hypnotic about the way he was looking at me. He didn't move, but the smile never left his face. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to come closer. I took a shaky step back, my breath coming in short gasps. But then, As if to reassure me that I was imagining things, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows behind the cemetery wall. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm my nerves. It was just a man, I told myself. Probably someone out for a late-night walk. There was no way it was the smiling man. But deep down, I knew I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to. The next few days were a blur. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the figure I saw was just a coincidence. But every time I walked by the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started avoiding that part of town, taking longer routes home and staying inside after dark. That's when the dreams started. At first, they were just vague flashes of darkness. But over time, the images became clearer. The figure, the smile, the feeling of being trapped, unable to move. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the fear still lingering in my chest. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of the smiling man. One night, about a week later, I was walking home with Lucy again. We passed by the cemetery, and I couldn't help but glance over at Smiling Avenue. It was quiet, the street lamps casting long shadows along the road. I saw him. I blurted out before I could stop myself. Lucy's eyes widened, and she stopped walking. What? When? Last week, near the cemetery. He was standing there, in the shadows. His smile was... It was horrible, Lucy. She looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. You saw him for real? She asked quietly. I nodded. Yeah. I didn't know what to do. I ran. But I keep seeing him in my dreams. And I swear, it's like he's always watching me now. Lucy's face grew pale. I told you, he doesn't just disappear. If you see him, he's always there. Watching. Waiting. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. What does he want? Lucy swallowed hard. He feeds on fear. People say he doesn't stop until you give him what he wants. And once you've seen him enough times, he doesn't just haunt you in your dreams anymore. He comes for you. I felt a chill run down my spine. Comes for me? What do you mean? I mean he won't leave until you're gone. You'll keep seeing him, and eventually, he'll get closer and closer, until you can't run anymore. The people who vanish, they say they're never the same after they see him. They're never seen again. Not really. I took a deep breath, trying to process what Lucy was saying. I'd already felt the fear, the unease. But now, it seemed like the legend wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was hunting me. That night, the smiling man appeared again. This time, I was in my room, trying to distract myself from the feeling of dread that had been growing in my chest. I stared out my window, trying to calm my nerves, when I saw him. Standing across the street, his face illuminated by the streetlight. His smile stretched wider than before, and his eyes, they gleamed with something dark. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as he stood there, unmoving, just staring at me. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the curtains shut and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The smiling man was real, and he was coming for me. The next few days were a blur of terror. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I could almost hear his footsteps behind me, feel his cold, empty smile lurking just out of sight. Then, one night, I was walking home after a late study session. I had almost made it back to my house when I saw him standing in the middle of the street. His tall, imposing figure was bathed in the light of the street lamp, his face twisted into that grotesque smile. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick and suffocating. But this time, something was different. This time, the smiling man started walking toward me. Step by step, his figure grew closer, the smile never fading from his face. I could hear the soft sound of his shoes against the pavement, each step like a drumbeat in the silence of the night. Please, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. Please leave me alone. But he didn't stop. He kept coming, his shadow stretching longer with every step. And then, just as he was within arm's reach, he stopped. The smile on his face widened, impossibly so. until it looked like it was going to split his face in two. I felt a cold, overwhelming dread fill me, suffocating me from the inside out. And then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows. I don't know how, but I found the strength to move. I ran home, my legs aching, my breath ragged. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, trembling unconscious. There's an old story in the town of Blackwater about a place everyone knows but no one dares to visit. Blackwater Bridge. It's just an old bridge, right? A worn-out structure that stretches over the Blackwater River. But for years, the locals have whispered about it, telling tales of strange happenings, ghostly figures, and dark things that linger in the shadows. I never paid much attention to the legend myself until the night I encountered it, when the legend turned into something far too real. I first heard about Blackwater Bridge when I was just a kid. My dad used to tell me stories about it, usually to get me to behave or to make sure I stayed close to home. "Don't go near that bridge after dark," he'd say, his tone sharp and serious. "It's bad luck, and I don't want you messing with things you don't understand." Of course, I was a kid, so I never took it seriously. I figured it was just one of those spooky stories adults tell to scare you. You know the kind, don't go to the woods after dark, or don't talk to strangers. Things that were meant to keep us from doing things we weren't supposed to. As I grew older, I heard the story more and more. People would mention the bridge in passing, but no one ever seemed to talk about it for long. I noticed the unease in their voices, a fear they couldn't quite explain. Some said they'd seen a figure standing at the bridge at night, staring down into the water. Others spoke of hearing strange noises when they got close, like the sound of footsteps that weren't their own. A few even claimed to have seen shadows moving along the bridge at the dead of night. Shadows that didn't belong to anyone. Still, I didn't think much of it. Sure, it was spooky, but it was just a legend, right? The night it all changed was the night my friends and I decided to go camping. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and 2 others, Mark and Jessica. We had been planning the trip for weeks. We were all excited to escape the noise of the city and spend a weekend in the woods. Tom, the most adventurous of the group, suggested we camp near Blackwater Bridge. "Why not?" he said. "We'll set up camp close to the bridge, just for fun. You know, see if any of those spooky stories are true." At first, I didn't mind. I wasn't scared of some old bridge, and the idea of a campfire and good company sounded much more exciting than staying home. So, we packed our bags, grabbed some gear, and headed out to Blackwater. The area around the bridge was beautiful during the day. The river wound through the forest like a silver ribbon, and the trees created a canopy that filtered the sunlight. But as evening fell, the atmosphere began to change. The forest felt quieter, the sounds of animals and insects seemed to disappear, and an eerie stillness took over. It wasn't long before we reached the spot Tom had picked for our campsite, just a short walk from the bridge. "We'll be fine," Tom said with a grin, unpacking our gear. "It's just a bridge. Nothing to worry about." We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the night eating, laughing, and telling ghost stories. But no matter how hard we tried to enjoy the evening, there was something off about the place. It felt like we weren't alone. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the bridge, where the shadows grew long, and I'd see a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Around midnight, we were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. That's when Mark pointed toward the bridge. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, his voice low. "There's something moving over there." We all turned to look. At first, I thought it was just the trees swaying in the wind, but then I saw it too, a figure, standing in the middle of the bridge. It was tall and dark, completely still, but I could tell it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. "Who's out there?" Tom shouted. "Hey, is someone messing with us?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. There was something unsettling about it, something wrong. The way it stood so still, like it was waiting for something, or someone. "Maybe it's just someone else camping," Jessica suggested, her voice trembling, but even she didn't sound convinced. We all sat in silence, staring at the figure. Then, Without warning, it moved. Not in a natural way, but in a jerky, almost mechanical motion. It took a step forward, then another, and another, until it was walking toward us. That's when I felt the first real pang of fear. Whoever that is, they need to leave, Tom said. Standing up, he grabbed a flashlight and started toward the bridge, but none of us followed. None of us wanted to be near that thing. Tom, wait, I called, but it was too late. He was already walking toward the figure. We watched in stunned silence as Tom approached the bridge. The closer he got, the more the figure seemed to shift, its body moving in strange, unnatural ways. It was like watching a shadow slowly stretching toward him. Tom stopped just short of the bridge, shining the flashlight into the figure's face. There was no expression, just an empty, black void where the eyes should have been. And then there was the smile. It stretched across the figure's face in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Too wide, too thin, and too perfect. I heard Tom shout, and then I saw him stumble back, his eyes wide with terror. "Run! Run!" he screamed. I didn't need another word. I grabbed my backpack and bolted toward the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. We all ran, pushing past trees and underbrush, not daring to look back. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like the figure was following us. But it never seemed to get any closer. When we finally reached the safety of our campsite, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. We could all feel it. Something was wrong. Something was watching us. Tom, panting and wild-eyed, finally spoke. It was smiling. The thing, it was smiling at me, he stammered. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like it was waiting for me to do something. Maybe we should just go, Sarah suggested, her voice shaking. This isn't right. We've been messing with things we don't understand. None of us argued. We quickly packed up our things and left, hurrying back toward the car, never looking back at Blackwater Bridge. When we made it back to the town, I felt a sense of relief. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. It wasn't just fear. It was a presence, like a shadow that lingered just out of sight. The night air felt thick, and every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, made my skin crawl. We all went to bed early that night, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. What was that thing on the bridge? Why had it smiled like that? And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something. A soft tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the tapping grew louder. I got up, heart racing, and looked out the window. There, in the dark, standing just beyond the yard, was a figure. A tall shadow, motionless, with that unmistakable smile. It was back, and it was waiting for me. I slammed the window shut, my breath quickening. I didn't know what I had seen at Blackwater Bridge, but I knew one thing for sure. The smiling man wasn't just a story, and now it was coming for me. Hollow Creek is a town that no one ever seems to remember fondly. It's one of those places that people talk about in hushed tones, like it's a chapter in their lives they'd rather forget. The stories that come out of there are strange, full of eerie happenings, ghostly whispers, and figures that shouldn't exist in the world. But for me, the legend of the Whistler was the one I couldn't shake, and it's the one that turned out to be all too real. I was just a kid when I first heard the story of the Whistler. It was during a summer visit to my aunt's house in Hollow Creek. Aunt Margie had lived in the town all her life, and she was one of the few people who didn't seem scared to talk about the legends that haunted it. I was visiting for the summer, trying to escape the heat of the city, and at first, I thought I was going to be bored out of my mind. But the town had a way of drawing you in, making you curious about things that seemed harmless at first. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Aunt Margie told me about the Whistler. "You ever hear about the Whistler, kid?" she asked, sipping her iced tea and rocking in her chair. I shrugged. Is that like another one of those creepy town stories? You know, the ones everyone tells to scare the new people? She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they're about to tell you something you might wish you hadn't heard. It's not just a story, Aunt Margie said, lowering her voice. The Whistler is real, and he's been around for years. My curiosity piqued. I leaned forward. Who is he? What does he do? Aunt Margie's eyes darkened as she stared out toward the woods at the edge of town. He's a man, or something that looks like one. People hear him at night, whistling from deep in the woods. At first, it sounds like just a regular tune, but if you listen long enough, it changes. It gets darker. The closer you are to it, the more twisted the tune becomes. And if you hear it long enough, well, they say he'll come for you. I frowned. Come for you? What does that mean? Aunt Margie didn't answer right away. She just stared out into the distance, her fingers tight around her glass. No one knows for sure. Some people say he's a spirit. Others think he's a man who lost his mind a long time ago. But everyone agrees on one thing. If you hear the Whistler's song, you need to get out of there fast. Because the longer you stay, the closer he gets. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't the heat of the summer night that made me uneasy. It was the way Aunt Margie said it, like she was trying to warn me, even though she didn't know how. I don't think I'd want to hear him, I said, trying to laugh it off, but I could tell that Aunt Margie wasn't joking. Listen to me, kid, she said, her voice low. You don't want to hear him. And whatever you do, don't go looking for him. Just don't. Promise me. I nodded, though part of me was curious. Who wouldn't want to know more about a mystery like that? But the seriousness in Aunt Margie's eyes made me hesitate. I didn't want to end up like some of the people in town who were rumored to have vanished after hearing the Whistler's song. The next few days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the town, riding my bike around the quiet streets, and hanging out with a couple of local kids I met, Ben and Ellie. They were nice, but they didn't talk much about the Whistler. They knew about it, though. Everyone in Hollow Creek did. Ben had once told me that his older brother had gone out into the woods one night after hearing the song, and he'd never come back. That was all he said about it. But it made me uneasy. I didn't think much about the Whistler again until one evening, when I was walking back from the small convenience store near the edge of town. The sun had just set, and the sky was fading from orange to dark purple. It was the perfect kind of summer night, quiet and peaceful. Or so I thought. As I made my way home, I heard something faint in the distance. It was a low, melodic whistle, floating through the air like the wind itself was carrying it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was a tune, soft and steady, but eerie in a way I couldn't quite explain. It reminded me of the kind of whistle you might hear from a train in the distance, but this was different. This was slower, almost haunting. I paused and looked around. The street was empty, and the sound of the whistle seemed to be coming from the woods on the far side of the town. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I had grown up in the city, and hearing strange sounds wasn't all that uncommon. But the longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. The tune seemed to change, just a little, becoming darker, almost like it was twisting itself into something wrong. Without thinking, I found myself walking toward the woods. My curiosity was piqued, and though a small voice in my head told me to turn back, I couldn't. I had to know what it was. The closer I got to the woods, the louder the whistling grew. It was as if the trees themselves were amplifying the sound, making it impossible to ignore. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I could see the faint outline of something in the shadows. A figure. Someone standing just beyond the tree line. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" The whistling stopped. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no response. The air felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, from the darkness, came the faintest rustle of leaves. Something was moving toward me, slow and deliberate. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence of the figure getting closer. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off of the shape moving toward me. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the whistling began again. But this time, it was louder, closer. It was no longer a simple tune. It was distorted, broken, like a song being played on a broken record. The notes scraped against my ears, each one more unsettling than the last. I could see the figure now. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a long, thin frame that seemed to stretch out of the shadows. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its mouth, its smile, was wide and unnaturally so, like something you would see in a nightmare. I froze. And then I heard it, loud and clear, coming from the figure in front of me. A voice, but not a normal one. It was a hiss, a whisper that seemed to seep into my very bones. Come closer. I didn't know how I moved, but my legs finally responded. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I sprinted back toward the safety of the street. Behind me, the whistling grew louder, more intense. It was chasing me, that much was clear. The air around me felt thick and heavy, and my lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, faster. I didn't stop until I reached my aunt's house, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I pressed my back against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. The next morning, I didn't tell Aunt Margie what had happened. How could I? She'd warned me, and I had ignored her. I knew better now, though. The Whistler wasn't just a story. It was real. I left Hollow Creek a few days later, my summer cut short. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the memory of that night haunting me. I haven't been back since, and I'm not sure I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it. A soft, distant whistle. And I can't help but wonder if the Whistler is still out there, waiting for someone else to hear his song. And I pray that whoever it is, they'll be smart enough to turn back before it's too late. Every town has its dark secrets, its urban legends that linger in whispers and shadows. In the small town of Ravenbrook, the legend of the Lady of the Black Mirror is the one that everyone knows but nobody wants to talk about. It's the kind of story that gets passed down through generations, told in hushed tones, always with a nervous laugh or a nervous glance toward the nearest dark corner. But what most people don't realize is that these stories are never really just stories. Sometimes the legends come to life, and when they do, they're far worse than anything we can imagine. It all started on a Saturday night, just like any other. My friends and I were hanging out at the local diner after a long day of doing, well, nothing. There were 6 of us, me, my best friend Mia, Ryan, Tyler, Kate, and Ben. We were all in our senior year of high school, stuck in that strange limbo between childhood and adulthood. We spent most of our time trying to find something to do in a town that didn't offer much. Let's do something different tonight, Ryan suggested, leaning back in his chair, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign reflecting in his eyes. How about the Lady of the Black Mirror? We all fell silent. Ryan wasn't known for making serious suggestions, but the mention of the Lady of the Black Mirror immediately caught my attention. I had heard about the Lady of the Black Mirror for as long as I could remember. The legend was simple but chilling. If you stood in front of a mirror at midnight and whispered her name 3 times, the Lady of the Black Mirror would appear. But she wasn't just any ghost. She was a spirit who would appear in the mirror, her face twisted and horrifying, her eyes full of malice. She would step out of the mirror, but only if you dared to keep staring at her. I'd always thought of it as one of those things people said to scare you. Something to tell little kids at sleepovers. But when Ryan brought it up again, a chill ran down my spine. The way he said it, with that gleam in his eyes, made me wonder if he was serious. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "No, I'm serious," Ryan replied. "I've heard people say it works. We should go try it." "No way," Mia said, shaking her head. "I don't want to mess with that kind of stuff. You know it's just an old story." But the rest of us were intrigued. Ben, who was always up for an adventure, grinned. "Come on, Mia. It'll be fun. Just a little midnight dare. What's the worst that could happen?" After some back and forth, everyone except Mia reluctantly agreed. Even she didn't seem completely convinced, but we managed to talk her into it. We decided to meet at Kate's house, where the only mirror large enough to do the ritual was located in the bathroom upstairs. It was a huge, antique mirror, the kind you'd see in old mansions, with a black frame that made it look almost ominous in the dim light. The clock struck midnight by the time we gathered in Kate's living room, our faces illuminated by the faint light from our phones. We had made sure to shut off all the lights, creating an eerie atmosphere in the house. The air felt heavier than usual, The kind of stillness that made your skin tingle. "You sure this is a good idea?" Kate asked, her voice low as she stood near the door, looking back toward the stairs. "It's just a story," Ryan said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice now too. "We'll be fine." Mia, as expected, stayed downstairs with the rest of us, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She looked like she regretted even agreeing to come, but it was too late to back out now. We all made our way to the bathroom, and I was the first to approach the mirror. It looked even more intimidating up close. The black frame seemed to swallow up the surrounding light, and I could see my reflection wavering slightly in the glass. My pulse quickened as I realized that I was about to do something I'd only heard about in creepy stories. "Okay, let's do this," Ryan said, stepping beside me. "We'll each say it 3 times. 1, 2, 3. The Lady of the Black Mirror." We all gathered around the mirror, and I could feel the tension in the air. My throat tightened, and I almost wanted to back out. But before I could change my mind, Ryan began. "The Lady of the Black Mirror," he said in a shaky voice. He looked into the mirror, his face pale under the dim light. "The Lady of the Black Mirror." We all joined in, our voices growing quieter with each repetition. "The Lady of the Black Mirror." I turned away for just a second, but when I looked back at the mirror, my heart stopped. Something was different. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but no. There, standing just behind our reflections, was a figure. A woman. She was tall and thin, her hair dark and flowing, but that wasn't what caught my attention. Her eyes were black, empty, hollow voids. Her skin was pale, almost as though it had been drained of color, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, as though it had been stretched unnaturally wide. I froze. My blood turned to ice as I realized what we had just done. Is she real?" Ben whispered, barely audible. I couldn't look away. Her eyes were locked on mine, and I could feel a coldness settling deep inside me. Then, slowly, the figure in the mirror began to move. At first, it was just a shift of the head. Then her hand reached up to touch the glass, her fingers leaving a trail of dark smudges as though the mirror was somehow absorbing her touch. And then, with a horrible slowness, she stepped out of the mirror. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the air around us. The room seemed to get darker, the walls pressing in, suffocating us. I stumbled backward, but my feet were frozen to the ground. The others were frozen too, eyes wide, mouths agape in terror. The Lady of the Black Mirror didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence was worse than any words. Her presence filled the room, as though she were all there was, the only thing that mattered. Her black eyes were fixed on each of us, and I could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical force pressing down on me. Mia let out a terrified sob, and that's when it happened. The lady turned her head slowly, almost lazily, toward her. Her smile twisted further, if that was even possible, and she stepped toward Mia, who was shaking uncontrollably. "Mia!" I shouted, but it was too late. The lady reached out, her fingers long and spindly, and I saw Mia's face pale as the air in the room seemed to thicken around her. She didn't scream. She didn't even move. It was as if the lady was draining the life out of her, and I could see it in her eyes. Mia was fading, her energy being stolen away. "Stop!" Kate screamed, rushing forward, but it was no use. She couldn't stop the lady. None of us could. In that moment, I realized something terrible. The Lady of the Black Mirror wasn't just a story. She was a being, a force of nature, and she fed on fear, on the life force of those who summoned her. She was ancient, and we had invited her into our world. With a final, horrible smile, the lady pulled her hand back and slowly retreated toward the mirror. Mia collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her face ashen and hollow. Without thinking, I grabbed Mia's arm and pulled her toward the door. We didn't stop to look back. We didn't stop until we were out of the house and back in the safety of the streetlights, gasping for air. Mia was pale, but she was alive. Barely. None of us ever spoke of that night again. We never talked about the Lady of the Black Mirror, or the fear that still gripped us when we looked into any reflective surface. We tried to forget, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The lady was still out there, waiting, and if you whisper her name again, she'll come for you too, just like she came for us. In the quiet town of Ashwood, where the streets are narrow and the houses are close together, there's an old story that everyone knows, though no one ever speaks of it after dark. It's called The Midnight Caller, and it's a legend passed down through generations, woven into the fabric of the town's history. People say that if you're alone at midnight, your phone will ring, and if you answer it, you'll hear a voice that isn't human. And if you don't hang up within 5 seconds, you'll never be the same again. I used to think it was just another ghost story. After all, Ashwood is full of them. Haunted woods, abandoned houses, strange lights in the sky. But I was about to learn that not all legends stay locked away in the past. Sometimes, they come for you when you least expect it. It was a Friday night, and I had just turned 16. My best friend, Jake, and I were hanging out at his house, like we usually did on weekends. We'd been talking about our plans for the summer, making jokes about going on stupid adventures, and wasting time like only teenagers can. "I swear," Jake said, rolling his eyes, "I'm going to find the stupid midnight caller just to prove it's fake." I laughed. "You really want to mess with that stuff? You heard the stories, right?" Jake grinned and grabbed his phone. Yeah. I'm not scared. I'm just saying, what's the worst that could happen? It's probably just some prank, right? Some idiot in the neighborhood messing with people." I shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant, but something about the story always gave me the creeps. The idea of a call coming in at midnight, from a number you couldn't trace, was unsettling. But I didn't want to seem like a coward in front of Jake, so I didn't say anything more. "I dare you to do it," Jake said, his voice challenging. "Call the midnight caller." I hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath. "Fine, I'll do it. But if anything happens, don't say I didn't warn you." We sat there, waiting for the clock to hit midnight. The old grandfather clock in the corner of Jake's living room ticked louder with each passing minute, and a tension settled in the air. I could see Jake's eyes glinting with mischief, but there was something else there too. Something that felt like unease, just underneath the surface. When the clock struck 12, Jake pulled out his phone. "All right," he said, holding it up. "Here we go. I'm going to dial the number. You ready?" I didn't want to seem scared, so I nodded. "Let's do it." He pressed the buttons, and we both leaned in, watching the screen. The phone dialed, but the number wasn't one we recognized. It was just a string of numbers, no name attached, just a blank, anonymous call. We waited for it to ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. The 4th ring sounded strange. It was a deeper, distorted tone, almost as if the phone itself was struggling to work. Then, without any warning, the ringing stopped. There was a pause, and then someone picked up. At first, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Just quiet, heavy breathing. I could feel my pulse quicken. I glanced at Jake, who had gone pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Hello?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end wasn't human. It was distorted, like it was being filtered through a tunnel or a static-filled radio. The voice spoke slowly, but each word was crisp, like it was trying to carve its way into my brain. "Don't hang up," it whispered, the words dripping with something dark, something cold. "You will be mine." I froze, my hand trembling as I reached for the phone. The words felt wrong, like they were crawling inside my head. Jake's face drained of color. "Dude," he whispered, "get rid of it. Hang up." But I couldn't. I was glued to the phone, unable to move, my mind spinning in confusion. It was like a part of me didn't want to let go, like something was forcing me to stay. Suddenly, the voice changed. It wasn't the same eerie whisper anymore. It was loud now, sharp, like it was right next to me. It felt like the phone was vibrating in my hand, vibrating through my entire body. "I will take you," it screamed. I snapped back to reality and slammed my finger on the end call button. The line went dead, and for a few seconds, everything was still. Jake and I stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Jake said, shaking his head. "I don't know." We sat there for a while, just in silence. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, like the air had turned thick with something we couldn't explain. I felt cold, like I had just been pulled into something I couldn't escape. But after a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a prank, some stupid thing someone had done to mess with us. I stayed at Jake's house that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that voice in my head. The distorted whisper, the scream. It echoed through my thoughts, twisting and turning, until I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just imagining it. I kept checking my phone, expecting another call, but nothing came. I thought I was in the clear. That is, until the next night. It was the same thing, Jake and I hanging out again, just like we had the night before. The clock struck midnight, and my phone buzzed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just some spam call. But when I looked down at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was the same number. The same unknown, untraceable number. I didn't even think about it. I just pressed ignore and tossed my phone aside. My heart was racing, my palms sweating. But even though I tried to shake it off, the unease didn't leave. Jake noticed me fidgeting. "What's up?" he asked. "That number," I muttered. "It called me again. It's the same one. The midnight caller." He frowned. "No way. That's freaky. You need to block it or something." But I couldn't. It was like a part of me was drawn to it. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. I couldn't stop hearing it in my head. That night, when I finally did fall asleep, the dreams came. They weren't like normal dreams. They were more like nightmares, real, tangible, and suffocating. I was in a dark room, standing in front of a black mirror, the same one I had seen the night before. I could hear the voice, faintly at first, but it grew louder. And then, it wasn't a voice anymore. It was a shape, a presence, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it getting closer. "You should have answered," it whispered. "Now, you belong to me." I woke up with a start, gasping for air. The room felt wrong. My phone was sitting on the nightstand, buzzing again. I didn't need to look at the screen. I knew who it was. The midnight caller. I didn't answer this time. I couldn't. The following days were filled with dread. The calls didn't stop. They came every night at midnight, sometimes 2 or 3 times. Each time, the voice grew clearer, more demanding. It wasn't just a prank anymore. It was something real, something I couldn't escape. And it wasn't just the calls. I started seeing things. Dark figures standing just outside my window, whispering my name. I heard footsteps when no one was around. The presence was everywhere, and it was coming for me. Jake tried to help, but there was nothing he could do. He said the voice was only coming to me, that I was the one who had summoned it. But I hadn't meant to. I hadn't wanted to invite something so dark into my life. I don't know what the midnight caller is, or where it came from. I don't know if it's something from the afterlife, or if it's some kind of ancient curse. All I know is that I've never felt the same since that first call. And now, every night at midnight, I wait, half afraid to pick up, half afraid not to. The voice is always there, waiting, just a phone call away. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly escape it, because the midnight caller never forgets. And once it has you, it won't let go. I don't know what the midnight caller is, or where it came from. I don't know if it's something from the afterlife, or if it's some kind of ancient curse. All I know is that I've never felt the same since that first call. And now, every night at midnight, I wait, half afraid to pick up, half afraid not to. The voice is always there, waiting, just a phone call away. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly escape it, because the midnight caller never forgets. And once it has you, it won't let go. Every town has its hidden places, the ones that even the bravest avoid. In the small town of Whispering Pines, that place is the old, overgrown forest at the edge of town. It's a place of legends, where the trees loom tall and thick, casting long, dark shadows that seem to move even when there's no wind. The forest has always been a bit mysterious, but it wasn't until the disappearance of Sarah Morgan that it became infamous. People started talking about the shadow, a figure that lurked in the trees, watching, waiting. I used to scoff at these stories, as most people did. I grew up in Whispering Pines and had spent countless hours exploring the forest as a kid. The stories of the shadow were just old wives' tales, meant to scare children away from wandering too far. Or so I thought. It was the summer before my senior year of high school when things started to get weird. Sarah Morgan was a girl from my school. Pretty, popular, the kind of person who always seemed to have everything figured out. But then, one day, she just vanished. No one knew where she went. Her parents said she'd gone for a walk in the woods and never came back. At first, the townspeople assumed she had run away. Maybe she was hiding out with some boy, or maybe she just needed a break from everything. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, hope started to fade. The sheriff's department searched the woods again and again, but they found nothing. No signs, no clues, just thick underbrush and silence. I remember the day it happened. I was walking home from school when I saw Sarah's mom sitting on her porch, her eyes red from crying. It was then that the rumors really started. People said they saw shadows moving in the forest, dark figures lurking just beyond the trees. They said Sarah's spirit was still out there, trapped by something, by someone, in those woods. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. I thought these were just wild stories, the kind people tell when they're scared. But then, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday night when I decided to go for a run in the forest. I wasn't thinking about Sarah or the shadow when I set out. I just needed to clear my head after a long week. The sun was setting, casting long, orange-gold rays through the trees, and the forest felt almost magical. It was peaceful, the kind of place where you could get lost in your thoughts. I'd been running for about an hour when I heard a rustling sound from deeper in the woods. It was strange because there was no breeze, no wind to move the branches. I slowed to a walk, trying to see what was making the noise. But it was dark now, and the underbrush was too thick to see anything clearly. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing through the trees. No one answered, but the rustling continued, getting louder. I was about to turn back when I saw something, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, almost human-shaped, but too thin, too dark. It moved between the trees, disappearing whenever I tried to focus on it. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I wasn't stupid enough to stick around and find out if this was one. I turned and started running, faster than I had run in years, not stopping until I burst out of the forest and back into the safety of the streetlights. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The shadow had felt real, too real to be a figment of my imagination. And it wasn't just me, it was what everyone in town was talking about now. People swore they had seen it, moving silently through the trees, watching them with its hollow eyes. Some said it looked like Sarah, her silhouette appearing and disappearing in the darkness. But others said it was something older, something more ancient and malevolent. The rumors started to spread. Some people claimed that Sarah had somehow become the shadow, trapped between worlds, unable to move on. Others said the shadow was something much worse, an evil spirit that had been living in the forest for centuries, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was late one night when I decided to confront the shadow. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know the truth. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way back into the forest. The night was dark, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves and earth. I moved slowly, trying not to make a sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches stretching out like claws, their leaves whispering secrets I couldn't understand. The forest felt alive, breathing, watching. And then, I saw it again, the shadow. This time, it was closer, right at the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was definitely human-shaped, but its outline was indistinct, like it was made of smoke. It moved toward me, silently, and I could feel its presence growing stronger, heavier. "Sarah?" I called out, hoping for some kind of explanation. But the shadow didn't respond. It just kept coming, step by step, closer and closer. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you want, but you need to leave. This isn't your forest." The shadow paused, its outline shifting, and then it started to move again, faster this time. I turned and ran, the sound of its footsteps echoing through the trees behind me. I didn't stop until I was out of the forest, back in the light of the street. The next day, the townspeople gathered at the church. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. People talked in whispers, their voices hushed, as if they were afraid to say the words out loud. "We need to do something about the shadow," Mrs. Morgan, Sarah's mother, said, her voice breaking. "We need to find her, find out what happened." The sheriff spoke next, his voice calm but firm. "We've searched the forest a dozen times. There's nothing there. No signs of Sarah, no evidence of anything unusual. But the shadow," someone else said, "it's real. We all saw it. We can't just ignore it." The sheriff looked around at all of us, his eyes hard. "There's no such thing as a shadow. There's nothing supernatural in those woods. It's all just stories, old wives' tales." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. I knew he didn't believe his own words. The shadow was real. I had seen it, felt it, and I knew it wasn't going to let us go that easily. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, watching from the edge of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to stop with Sarah. It was going to keep coming, until it got what it wanted, whatever that might be. There's an urban legend that circulates every year at school, especially around Halloween. It's the kind of story that the older kids tell to scare the younger ones. But as time goes on, people start wondering if there's some truth to it. It's called The Man in the Mirror, and the basic story goes like this. If you stand in front of a mirror at midnight, with the lights off, and say, "I want to see the man in the mirror," he will appear behind you. You're supposed to turn around, and if you don't, the man will reach out and grab you. Some people say he'll drag you into the mirror itself. Others say he'll just disappear, leaving you with a terrible sense of dread. Like most people, I laughed it off. It seemed silly, just another story to make the dark feel scarier than it really was. But after the strange things started happening, I couldn't dismiss it anymore. I've always been skeptical when it comes to stuff like this. Growing up in a small town, there weren't many things to do, so we'd entertain ourselves with urban legends and ghost stories. My friends and I would gather in basements or out in the woods, trying to scare each other with stories of monsters and ghosts. But none of us ever really believed in them. It was all fun and games, a way to pass the time. That all changed when I was 16. It was the night of my birthday, and I was home alone, taking advantage of the quiet to finally finish up some homework. My parents were out for the evening, and my older brother, Zach, was away at college. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my phone, when I got a text from Mia, my best friend. Mia had always been the one to bring up the legends. She was into all that spooky stuff, always trying to convince me that there was more to the world than we could see. But that night, her text made my heart skip a beat. It was just a few words. "I dare you to try the mirror game. Midnight. Alone." I was about to laugh it off, but the idea of being alone at night, with the house completely quiet, suddenly seemed a little more unsettling. It wasn't that I was scared, but, well, there was something about mirrors. They can be creepy when you stare into them too long, like your reflection might start doing its own thing. Still, I didn't want to back down. I replied to her, "Fine, I'll do it. But don't say I didn't warn you." That night, as the clock struck midnight, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The house was still. I couldn't hear anything, not even the usual hum of the refrigerator or the faint creaks of the old wooden floors. My reflection stared back at me, as it always did. I took a deep breath and muttered the words, "I want to see the man in the mirror." At first, nothing happened. I let out a small laugh, telling myself it was just a silly game. But then, I felt it. A chill. It started at the back of my neck and slowly spread down my spine. My breath hitched as I stared into the mirror, feeling the air grow heavy around me. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw something. A shape, dark and formless, moving just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. There was no one there, just the soft glow of the bathroom light and the silent walls. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. The shape was still there, just a faint blur behind me. I could feel it now, almost like it was standing right next to me. I swallowed hard. "It's nothing," I told myself. Just your mind playing tricks. But the longer I stared at the reflection, the more I began to feel like something was wrong. The figure in the mirror was growing clearer, its shape becoming more defined. It looked like a man, but there was something off about him. His eyes were dark, hollow, and his face was just wrong. It wasn't human. There was no warmth, no life in it, just an eerie, empty stare. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but I couldn't. The man in the mirror began to move. He raised a hand, slowly, as if he were reaching out for me. My own reflection mirrored the action, but it didn't feel like it was me. It felt like I was watching someone else. The man's hand grew closer, inch by inch, until it was only a few inches from my own face. I backed away, my breath coming out in short gasps, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed, frozen in place, like the man was still standing in front of me, just waiting. Then, the air around me grew colder, colder than I could stand. My teeth began to chatter. My skin prickled, as though every nerve in my body was being slowly numbed by the chill. The figure in the mirror grew more menacing, its form darkening, becoming more defined. The man's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just the hollow, empty darkness of the space beyond his lips. Suddenly, I heard something. A low, soft whisper, almost like a breath, right next to my ear. My heart jumped in my chest, and I whipped around. No one was there. My bedroom door was still closed, and everything was silent. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Come closer," the voice said, and it was deep, distorted, like it didn't belong to a human at all. I turned back to the mirror, my heart racing in my chest. The man's figure was clearer now, his eyes wide and unblinking, his lips stretched into a grotesque smile. He reached forward again, but this time his hand didn't stop at the glass. It kept coming, inching closer to me. I froze. The man in the mirror began to move faster. His hand was almost through the glass, reaching out as though it could grab me, pulling itself from the other side of the mirror. My reflection remained still, lifeless, as if it had abandoned me completely. My own reflection. I realized it wasn't just the man in the mirror reaching for me anymore. I was moving too, slowly, but surely. My reflection was inching toward the mirror as if it wanted to pull me into the glass with it. I tried to scream, to move, to break free, but my body wouldn't obey. I tried to tear myself away, but the mirror felt like a magnetic force, pulling me back. My heart thudded in my chest as the coldness surrounded me. I wanted to look away, to stop staring, but I couldn't. I couldn't break the connection. And then, just as the man's hand was almost through the mirror, I snapped out of it. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I fell backward, away from the bathroom mirror. I slammed my palm against the wall, trying to break free of the fog that clouded my mind. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. When I finally gathered my senses, I ran. Ran from the bathroom and out of the house. I didn't stop until I was at Mia's house, pounding on the door, gasping for breath. She answered in her pajamas, looking confused but concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking from the panic in my eyes. I didn't know how to explain it to her, so I just pointed back toward my house. The man in the mirror, he's real. It's not just a game. It's not just a story. He's real. Mia didn't seem to believe me at first, but the fear in my eyes convinced her. We went back to my house, and when we stepped into the bathroom, there was no sign of what had happened. No shadowy figure in the glass, no cold air. But when I looked into the mirror, I saw it. My own reflection. And just for a moment, I could have sworn it smiled at me. A slow, knowing smile. And then it was gone. I've never played that game again. I don't think I ever will. And every time I walk past a mirror, I can't help but wonder if he is watching me from the other side. The man in the mirror may not be there every time, but I know now that he's always waiting, always watching. And next time, maybe he won't let me go so easily. But if you're ever alone at midnight, staring into a mirror, and you hear a whisper behind you, just know, it's not a story. It's not a game. The man in the mirror is real, and he might just come for you too. The small town of Eldridge Hollow had always been quiet. Too quiet, in fact. People would pass through on their way to the next town over, maybe stop at the local diner or gas station, but no one ever really stayed. There was a strange kind of unease that clung to the place, like an old secret buried deep in its past. Everyone knew it, but no one ever talked about it. I grew up in Eldridge Hollow. My name is Claire, and for most of my life, I didn't think much about the strange atmosphere of the town. After all, it was where I lived, and I was used to it. But there were stories, the kind of stories that kids would tell each other around campfires or at sleepovers, meant to scare each other for fun. One of those stories was about the Whistler. People would say that if you were ever alone at night, you might hear a strange whistling sound coming from inside the walls of your house. At first, it was barely noticeable, like the wind outside, but the longer you listened, the clearer it would become. And once you heard it, you couldn't escape it. The Whistler was said to be someone, or something, that had been trapped in the walls for years. It would mimic the sounds of whistling, at first, gentle and quiet, but then it would grow louder and more sinister until it drove the person crazy. Some people claimed that the Whistler would eventually appear, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes, seeking out those who had heard it. And once it found you, well, no one really knew what happened after that. Like most kids, I laughed it off. It was just a story, right? Nothing more than a way to get a reaction out of people. But deep down, there was always a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, especially when I was alone in my room at night. I would hear strange noises, creaks and groans that made my heart race, but I always blamed it on the old house we lived in. It was creaky, after all, with the kind of noises you'd expect from a house that had been around for a century. That is, until one night, I heard it. It was late, too late to be up, but I couldn't sleep. I had been lying in bed for over an hour, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. My parents were in bed, the whole house was dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. That's when I first heard it. A soft whistling, barely perceptible, but they're all the same. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, but the sound seemed to be coming from inside the house, beneath the floorboards in the walls. It was faint, like a melody, and it made my skin crawl. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping in my chest, straining to hear. The whistling grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just random whistling either. It was as if it were trying to form a tune, a soft and eerie melody that sent chills down my spine. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. Old houses creaked and groaned all the time, right? There was nothing to be afraid of. But then the whistling changed. It became a little more deliberate, more controlled, almost like it was taunting me. The air in my room grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was no longer imagining it. Someone, was in the walls, and they were whistling. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and texted my mom. "Mom, do you hear that? It's whistling." But she didn't respond. My heart started to race faster as the sound continued. It was louder now, like it was just outside my bedroom door. I told myself to get up, to go check, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My room was freezing, the air thick with an unexplainable tension. I could feel it, the presence of something just beyond the walls. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whistling stopped. But it didn't end there. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't bring myself to, not after the fear I had felt. I chalked it up to the house settling or the wind. It was just another night of weird sounds, I told myself. The problem was, the whistling didn't stop. It continued. Every night, without fail, it would start just after midnight, faint at first, then growing louder and louder until it was like a tune being played just for me. I began to dread the nights. I would try to stay awake, hoping it would stop, but it was like clockwork. The whistling would begin, echoing in my room, in my mind. I would cover my ears, curl up in a ball under my blanket, trying to block it out, but nothing worked. It was like it was coming from inside me, not just the walls. One night, it became unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and went searching for the source of the sound. I crept down the hallway, moving carefully past the bedrooms of my parents and brother, until I reached the stairs that led to the basement. The whistling was louder here, like it was coming from deep in the ground. My flashlight shook in my hand as I moved down the stairs, the beams of light flickering in the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, the whistling grew louder still. I could feel it vibrating in my bones. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like it was alive, like it was trying to get my attention. I followed the sound, my feet almost moving of their own accord, until I reached the far wall of the basement. There, beneath the exposed pipes and dusty shelves, I noticed something strange. The wall seemed wrong. The paint was peeling, and there was an odd dampness to the area that I hadn't noticed before. The whistling was almost deafening now, and I could feel it pressing in on me, pulling me toward the wall. I reached out and touched it. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like ice. As soon as my fingers brushed against it, the whistling stopped, and then the wall moved. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. The wall shifted slightly, as if something behind it had been disturbed. I could see the outline of a door, a hidden door, slowly appearing, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. My flashlight flickered, but I couldn't look away. I had to know. I had to open it. I didn't even think twice before pushing the door open. The whistling began again, but it was louder now, more frantic, as though something on the other side was desperate for me to hear it. What I saw when I opened the door was something I'll never forget. The room behind the door was small, no more than a closet, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. The walls were lined with old, yellowing newspapers, and in the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention. It was the man sitting in it. His back was to me, but I could see him clearly in the dim light. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale and ashen, and his hair was long and unkempt, tangled around his face. His hands were clasped together in his lap, but his head was tilted to one side, as if listening intently to something only he could hear. The whistling grew louder, more urgent. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes locked on the man's back, as the whistling slowly turned into something else. Something darker. Something sinister. He was the whistler. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the presence of whatever was trapped behind those walls. I didn't know what it was, or how long it had been there, but I knew one thing for sure. The stories were true. The whistler was real, and it was never going to stop until it had what it wanted. That night, I left Eldridge Hollow. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the whistling still echoing in my mind. I've never returned, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again. That soft, haunting whistle, growing louder and louder, like a song I can't escape. And I know, wherever I am, whatever house I live in, I will never truly be free from the whistler in the walls.